Clara Whitmore slammed the letter down on the banker's desk so hard the inkwell rattled. "You took the bakery," she said, her voice low and steady, even though her hands were shaking. "You took the storehouse. You took every acre my father bled to own. And now you're telling me the debt still isn't cleared." The banker didn't even look up from his ledger. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "a woman in your position ought to be thinking about finding a husband rather than arguing with numbers she doesn't understand. If Clara's story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me because what happens next will change everything you think you know about strength, dignity, and what it means to finally be seen. The banker's name was Gerald Pruitt, and he had been dismissing women across that oak desk for 31 years without ever losing a night of sleep over it. He was a small man made large by the authority pinned to his chest, and he wore that authority the way other men wore hats, like it belonged to him by birthright and could never be taken away. Clara stared at him for a long moment. She had rehearsed this conversation on the walk over. She had gone through the numbers a dozen times the night before, sitting at the kitchen table in the house that no longer belonged to her, with a candle burning low and her mother's old ledger spread open between her hands. She knew what she was owed. She knew what had been taken. She had the figures memorized the way some women memorized scripture, because for Clara, Whitmore numbers had always been the one language that told the truth when people wouldn't. "I understand the numbers perfectly, Mr. Pruitt," she said. He finally looked up. Something passed across his face, not quite contempt, not quite pity, but the particular expression men like him reserved for women who refused to become invisible when it was most convenient. "The estate liquidation covered 83% of the outstanding balance," Clara continued. "That leaves a remaining debt of $214. I am not disputing the debt. I am asking you whether the bank intends to give me a reasonable payment arrangement, or whether it intends to simply bury a grieving woman under a number she cannot possibly meet in a single month." Pruitt set down his pen. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, as though choosing words for a child. "Your father was a good man. I respected Elias Whitmore. But the business failed. These things happen. The bank cannot be expected to absorb losses on account of sentiment." "I'm not asking you to absorb losses," Clara said. "I'm asking for 60 days. The bank's policy, Clara said, extends 60-day arrangements to men who owe 3 times this amount. I've seen it done. I know it's been done. Theodore Graves owed $400 2 years ago and walked out of this office with 6 months to make it right." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Theodore Graves," he said carefully, "is a man of standing in this community." The room went quiet. Clara heard it the full weight of what he was really saying. Not that Theodore Graves had better credit. Not that Theodore Graves had more assets. But that Theodore Graves was a man, and that a man of modest means still occupied a category of person that Clara Whitmore, at 25 years old, round-faced and plain-dressed, and carrying nothing but a dead woman's arithmetic, would simply never reach, no matter how correct her numbers were. She picked up the letter from the desk. She folded it in half with clean, deliberate movements. She tucked it into her coat pocket. "Thank you for your time," she said. She walked out. She did not cry until she reached the far end of the boardwalk around the corner, where the milliner's overhang blocked the view from the street. And even then, she allowed herself only a few seconds before she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, steadied her breathing, and lifted her chin again. Her mother had been in the ground for 11 days. She had exactly $4.60 to her name. And she had exactly one option left. The posting had been tacked to the general store board for 2 weeks before Clara noticed it, or rather before she allowed herself to notice it. She had walked past it 4 times in those 2 weeks, reading it from the corner of her eye, the way you read a thing you're not yet ready to want. Cook wanted Callahan Ranch 12 miles east. Steady work. Fair wages. Apply in person. Ask for Foreman Reed. She had heard of Callahan Ranch. Everyone in Willow Creek had heard of Callahan Ranch. Wyatt Callahan was the kind of name that people said with a particular weight, the way they said drought or winter, not with fear exactly, but with the understanding that it was a force to be reckoned with and not provoked. He owned more land than anyone in the county. He ran a clean operation. He paid his men on time and expected twice what most ranchers demanded. He had lost his wife 6 years ago under circumstances nobody discussed openly, and since then, he had kept to himself, kept his daughter close, and kept the rest of the world at a distance that most people learned not to test. He was also, according to Millie Chambers at the dry goods store, the most unapproachable man in 3 counties. "You're not seriously considering it," Millie had said, lowering her voice, even though they were the only 2 in the store. "I need work," Clara had said simply. "Clara." Millie leaned across the counter. She was kind, Millie, in the particular way of women who meant well and still managed to make you feel smaller than when you walked in. "Callahan Ranch is 12 miles out. It's isolated. The man barely speaks. And his last cook, well, she left after 2 months and she wouldn't say why." "Did she say she was mistreated?" Millie hesitated. "No. She just said it wasn't what she expected." "Then I'll go find out what to expect for myself." Millie had looked at her with that familiar expression, the one Clara had been seeing on people's faces her entire life. Half worry, half something else. Something that said you're brave for someone in your position, which really meant you're brave for someone who doesn't have much choice. Clara thanked her for the information and walked back to the posting board and read the notice one more time. And then she made her decision with the same quiet finality. She made every decision by accepting the facts in front of her and choosing the action most likely to result in survival. She was not going to Callahan Ranch to find a husband. She was going to Callahan Ranch because she needed to eat. She hired a wagon driver for 50 cents and arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the air had turned sharp and the sky was the particular pale gray of early winter, threatening to arrive ahead of schedule. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Reed, with a weathered face and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to arrange itself into a smile, met her at the main gate. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked. The way men looked at women, they were assessing not as people, but as labor, calculating in a single glance whether the physical arrangement of her body matched their expectations of what a ranch cook ought to be. Whatever he calculated, he kept to himself. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "That's right." "You have references." "I do." She handed him the folded papers. 3 letters, one from her mother's old employer in the county seat, one from the minister at First Methodist, who had eaten at the Whitmore table more times than he could count, and one she had written herself detailing her experience running the family bakery for 4 years before the debt caught up with them. She handed Reed the legitimate ones and let him draw his own conclusions about the third. Reed read them without expression. He folded them back. "Kitchen's in rough shape," he said. "Last woman didn't keep it well. You'll be feeding 30 men twice a day, sometimes more during drive season. Mr. Callahan expects meals on the table at 5:30 and 6 sharp, not 5:32, not 6:01. You understand?" "I understand." Pay is $7 a month, room and board included. Separate quarters attached to the main house private entrance. You'll have nothing to complain about on that account. He paused. You'll also be expected to keep out of matters that don't concern you. Clara looked at him steadily. "I came to cook," she said. "That's all." Something shifted in Reed's expression. Not quite approval, but the beginning of something that might become it eventually. "Follow me," he said. The kitchen was every bit as rough as Reed had described, and then some. Clara stood in the doorway and took it in the cold hearth. The poorly stacked shelves, the work table with a deep crack running down the center that had been filled with some kind of black grease instead of properly repaired. Pots hung from ceiling hooks in no particular order. The flour barrel had been left open and something had gotten into it. The window above the dry sink faced north and let in little light and considerable draft. She stood there for a long moment. Reed stood behind her, clearly waiting to see if she would turn around and ask to be driven back to town. She walked to the flour barrel, assessed the damage, set it aside. She crossed to the hearth, examined the flue, found it functional, but filthy. She ran her hand along the work table, felt the crack, thought about how to work around it. She turned to Reed. "I'll need the crack in that table filled properly before I can use it safely. I'll need the flour barrel emptied, cleaned, and refilled from fresh stock. I'll need the flue swept before I light this hearth. And I'll need a second water bucket because one is not sufficient for the volume I'll be producing." Reed stared at her. "Is any of that negotiable?" she asked. "No," he said after a moment. "I'll have it seen to." "Then I can start Thursday," Clara said. "That gives me tomorrow to learn the supply situation and plan the first week's menus." Reed nodded slowly. "Mr. Callahan will want to meet you this evening." "Of course." She said it easily. But something tightened in her chest. Not quite nerves, not quite fear. Something more like the careful bracing of a woman who had been underestimated so many times that she had learned to prepare for it, the way you prepared for bad weather, not by hoping it wouldn't come, but by making sure she was dressed for it when it did. She met Wyatt Callahan at 6 o'clock in the front room of the main house. He was taller than she expected, lean in the way of men who worked hard and slept little and ate whatever happened to be available rather than whatever they preferred. Dark hair going gray at the temples. Eyes that were a shade of brown so deep they were nearly black, and that held in them the particular quality of a man who had stopped expecting things to go the way he hoped. He looked at her the way Reed had assessing, but there was something different in his look. Where Reed had been calculating labor, Callahan was calculating something else. Something more complicated, as though he was trying to determine not just whether she could do the job, but whether having her here would create a problem he hadn't anticipated. He didn't offer his hand. He stood with his arms crossed, his weight back, and he studied her with an expression that was neither rude nor welcoming, but simply present. Like a man who had learned to gather information before deciding anything. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Callahan. Reed tells me you made a list of demands before you'd agree to start." Clara didn't flinch. "Reed tells me you expect punctuality and quality. A cook cannot deliver either without proper tools and a functional workspace. I asked for what I need to do the job well. I assumed that would be preferable to asking for nothing and producing inferior results." Silence. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of something that might have been one in a different life. "Fair enough," he said. "My daughter is 7 years old. Her name is Emma. She has her meals with me, not with the hands. She is not to be treated as a task. She is not to be ignored. And she is not to be lied to. Whatever else you do or don't do in my kitchen, those 3 things are non-negotiable. Are we clear?" Clara felt something shift in her chest unexpectedly without warning. The way you felt the ground move before you'd registered that it was moving. "We're clear," she said. "Then you start Thursday," he said. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." He turned and walked back toward the hallway, and she was dismissed the way you dismissed a business arrangement, cleanly, efficiently, without sentiment. She stood there for the moment after he was gone. She thought about the little girl she hadn't met yet. About the way Callahan's voice had changed almost imperceptibly, just the smallest softening when he said Emma's name. About the 3 things he had said were non-negotiable, none of which were about the food. She thought about what kind of man listed his daughter's dignity as a condition of employment. And she thought, well, this is unexpected. Then she put the thought away carefully, the way you put away something valuable in uncertain territory, and she went to find Reed to discuss the supply inventory. The first morning she woke in her quarters before 4 o'clock. She lay still in the dark for a moment and listened to the ranch sounds, the distant movement of cattle, the wind against the north wall, the faint creak of the main house settling. She thought about Willow Creek, about the banker and his ledger and his certainty that she ought to be thinking about finding a husband. She got up. She lit the lamp. She went to work. By 5:15, the fire was burning clean in the hearth, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and something the ranch hands wouldn't be able to name but would recognize instinctively as the smell of someone who knew what they were doing. The first man through the door at 5:28 was a hand named Cody Young and barrel-chested, with hay still in his hair, who stopped dead in the doorway when he smelled the coffee and looked at Clara with an expression of pure animal gratitude. "Ma'am," he said. "Sit down," she said. "It'll be ready at 5:30. He sat, At 5:30, she put the food on the table. Eggs fried properly, not the gummy undercooked eggs that apparently the previous cook had considered acceptable. Biscuits that had risen the way biscuits were supposed to rise. Salt pork crisped at the edges. Coffee that was strong without being bitter. The hands filed in. Some of them looked at her. Some of them looked at the food. Most of them sat down and started eating without a word, which was its own form of communication. One man, older, broad, with a gray beard and an expression that suggested he had opinions about everything, and kept most of them sat down across from Cody and looked at Clara with something less than welcome in his eyes. His name was Dutch Marsh, and Clara would learn within 24 hours that he was the unofficial second voice on the Callahan Ranch, the man whose approval or disapproval carried weight with the other hands in ways that Reed's authority sometimes couldn't reach. Dutch picked up a biscuit. He looked at it. He broke it in half. He looked at the inside. He looked at Clara. He put it in his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. He picked up his coffee cup and drank. He set it down. He said nothing. But he refilled his plate. And Clara, watching from the far end of the kitchen with her back to the room and her face carefully arranged into neutrality, allowed herself a single quiet breath of something that might, on a very charitable accounting, have been described as satisfaction. Emma Callahan arrived in the kitchen doorway at noon on Clara's second day, and she stood there with her arms crossed and her small chin raised and an expression on her face that was so precisely her father's that Clara nearly laughed out loud. She was 7 years old, and she had her father's dark eyes and her father's particular way of looking at things, like she was gathering information before deciding whether to trust it. "You're the new cook," Emma said. "I am," Clara said. She was slicing bread, and she kept slicing because she had learned long ago that children relaxed more easily when adults didn't make the children themselves the point of the interaction. "Mrs. Holt said you'd probably leave inside a month." "Who's Mrs. Holt?" "She does washing for Papa sometimes. She comes from town." A pause. "She said it a lot, to different people." "Did she?" Clara said. "She said the ranch was too lonely and too far, and that you'd be gone by Christmas." Clara set down the bread knife. She turned and looked at Emma directly, fully, the way she had found children responded to, because children were often treated as though they existed slightly off to the side of real conversations, and they always knew it. "What do you think?" Clara asked. Emma considered this with great seriousness. "I think you fixed the kitchen table." "I did. Papa said the last cook never fixed the table even when he offered to have it done." "A cracked work table is a liability," Clara said. "You can't prepare food properly on a surface that isn't stable." Emma looked at her for another moment. "Do you know how to make apple cake?" she asked. "I do." "With the cinnamon on top, not just inside." "Both inside and on top," Clara confirmed. Emma uncrossed her arms. "All right," she said with the decisive air of someone concluding a negotiation. "I'll come back at 2 o'clock. Papa lets me have an hour after lessons." "I'll be here," Clara said. Emma turned and walked away, and Clara watched her go with a feeling in her chest that took her a moment to identify something complicated, something that mixed the simple warmth of having made a small connection with the ache of understanding exactly how lonely a 7-year-old girl had to be to negotiate friendship with the cook over the terms of a cinnamon cake. She went back to her bread. The first time she heard what people were saying about her, it came from an indirect direction, the way bad news usually arrived. Not straight at you, but angled, so that by the time it reached you, it had gathered speed from bouncing off every surface in between. She had gone into town on the supply wagon with Reed, 10 days after she started to help select from the dry goods, rather than trusting a list to the discretion of a man who considered flour and salt a complete inventory. While Reed was at the feed store, she stopped at Millie Chambers' counter for thread and 2 buttons. Millie greeted her warmly enough. But there was something in Millie's eyes, a particular kind of social discomfort, the look of a woman who knew something she wasn't sure whether to say. Clara waited. Millie folded the thread into paper and kept her voice low. "Victoria Lawson was in here yesterday," she said. Clara didn't know the name. She said so. Millie's expression shifted. "You should. She's been telling people well. She paused. She's been telling people that the only reason Callahan hired a woman like you is because no decent woman would take the position. Clara was quiet for a moment. A woman like me, she repeated. Millie's eyes went to the floor. She said she implied that you must have been very persuasive in the way you presented yourself in the interview. The thread and buttons lay on the counter between them. Clara picked them up. She counted out the correct coins and laid them down. Thank you, Millie, she said. Clara, I appreciate you telling me. She picked up her purchase. I'll need to catch Reed at the feed store. She walked out. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the October cold, with the sound of the town moving around her, the creak of wagon wheels. Two men arguing good-naturedly outside the barber shop, a dog barking somewhere down the street, and she breathed. She had been 11 years old, the first time a schoolyard boy told her she was too large to be worth anything. She had been 16 the first time a man looked through her at the counter of her father's bakery, as though she were a piece of furniture standing inconveniently between him and someone more interesting. She had been 19 when a young man who had called on her 3 times stopped calling without explanation, and she had overheard him tell a friend that she was perfectly pleasant, but that a man had to think about these things practically. She had been living inside other people's assessments of her body for 25 years. She was tired. She was also, she noted with a kind of distant clarity, still standing. She went to find Reed. She didn't learn who Victoria Lawson was until 3 days later when the woman appeared at the ranch. She arrived in a private buggy, which already said something. A private buggy meant hired help and a family wealthy enough to own the kind of horse that made pulling one look effortless. Victoria Lawson was 28, dark-haired and beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful when they have been told about it long enough that they have absorbed it into their posture and their voice and the precise angle at which they hold their head. She was not there to see Clara. She was there to see Wyatt. Clara knew this because she was in the kitchen visible through the open window when Victoria arrived and dismounted with the practiced grace of a woman who had done it in front of an audience many times. She watched Reed go to fetch Callahan. She went back to her work, but the window was open, and voices carried. Wyatt, Victoria said, not Mr. Callahan, but Wyatt like a claim. I haven't seen you at church in 3 weeks. People are starting to talk. People always talk, Callahan's voice said. What brings you out here, Victoria? I heard you hired a new cook. A pause. From Willow Creek. Word travels. I suppose it does. Another pause, carefully constructed. I just wanted to... I suppose I wanted to make sure you were well. You know this part of the county, Wyatt. People notice things. And with a woman living on the property under your roof. Her quarters have a private entrance, Callahan said. There's nothing to notice. Of course. But people have been saying things about her, Wyatt. About why she's here. About what kind of woman takes a position this isolated when she could find work in town. A delicate hesitation. I only brought it up because I care about your reputation, and about Emma's. Silence. Clara's hands had stopped moving over the work table. She had not intended to eavesdrop. She was listening anyway. Miss Whitmore, Callahan said, came to this ranch with references. She has done every part of her job with more competence than anyone I've hired in 4 years. My daughter has apple cake for the first time since she was 3. A pause shorter than Victoria's pauses, less practiced, more certain. If people in town have something to say about that, they're welcome to say it to me directly. Was there anything else you needed, Victoria? Another silence. No, Victoria said. No, I don't suppose there was. Clara heard the sound of the buggy leaving. She heard Callahan's boots on the porch measured unhurried, and then the main door of the house, and then silence. She stood at the work table for a long moment. She was not naive enough to think that what she had overheard was the end of something. Victoria Lawson had the particular quality of a woman who did not accept dismissals gracefully, and she had made it clear in the careful architecture of everything she had said that she knew exactly how to use other people's opinions as a weapon. Clara picked up the paring knife. She went back to work. 3 days after Victoria's visit. Dutch Marsh sat down at the far end of the work table where Clara was grinding spices for the following morning, and said without preamble, "You know what they're saying about you in town." It wasn't a question. "I've heard some of it," Clara said. Dutch was quiet for a moment. He had a habit of sitting with his hands folded on the table in front of him, like a man at a church service, who wasn't sure he believed in the service, but had decided to give it a fair hearing anyway. "Woman named Lawson," he said. "So I've gathered. She's been after Wyatt for 2 years," Dutch said. "Since about a year after his wife died. She figured the waiting period was over, I reckon, and then you showed up." He looked at her sideways. "She's the kind of woman who's never been told no by anything she actually wanted." "I'm not competing with anyone," Clara said. "I'm the cook." "That's not how she sees it." Clara set down the grinding stone. She looked at Dutch directly. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I arrived at this ranch with $4.60 to my name 2 weeks after I buried my mother, because a bank took everything my family owned, and a man in a suit told me I ought to be thinking about finding a husband rather than arguing with arithmetic. I came here to work. I came here to survive. I intend to do both, and I intend to do them without becoming anyone's story about why a woman like me can't be trusted." Dutch looked at her. For a long moment, he just looked. Then he unfolded his hands and put them flat on the table and pushed himself to standing. "You want to know what Wyatt Callahan said to me the morning after you arrived," he said. Clara waited. "He said, 'That woman fixed the kitchen table.'" Dutch picked up his hat from the bench. "Been broken 3 years. She fixed it in a day." He settled the hat on his head. "Wyatt Callahan doesn't say much, but what he says he means." He walked out. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment in the gathering dark with the smell of ground spices around her and the fire burning low in the hearth, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something fragile and warm and small. A coal is small, but still carries heat. Not hope exactly. She was too careful for hope. But something in that neighborhood. She banked the fire for the night. She went to her quarters. She slept better than she had in weeks. It was Emma who first cracked something open that Clara had kept carefully sealed. They had been baking together for 2 weeks. Apple cake on Tuesdays, whatever Emma wanted to learn on Thursdays. And Emma had turned out to be an attentive, precise, and occasionally fierce student, who did not accept vague instructions and wanted to understand the why behind every step. "Why does the butter need to be room temperature?" Emma demanded one Thursday, watching Clara with narrowed eyes. "Because cold butter won't blend properly with the sugar," Clara said. "It'll leave chunks. The texture of the whole cake depends on how well those two things combine at the beginning. What happens if you rush it? You get a cake with wrong texture, edible but not right." Emma considered this. "Papa says most mistakes happen because people rush." "Your father is right about that." Emma was quiet for a moment, concentrating on her stirring with the focused intensity she brought to everything. "Do you miss your mother?" she asked. The question came without warning, the way children's questions always did, not from cruelty, but from the simple directness of someone who hadn't yet learned that some questions required a runway. Clara kept her hand steady. "Yes," she said. "Every day." "I miss mine too," Emma said. "I don't really remember her. I was only 1. A pause, still stirring. "Papa doesn't talk about her. I think it makes him too sad." "That's understandable," Clara said carefully. "Do you think sadness goes away?" Emma asked. Clara thought about this for a real moment, not a polite moment, but an actual one. "I think it changes," she said. "I think it gets quieter over time. Not gone, but quieter. Like," she searched for the right comparison, "like how a fire gets smaller after a while. It doesn't mean it's not still warm. It just means it's not burning as loud." Emma stopped stirring. She looked at Clara with an expression that was too old for her face, the look of a child who has spent too much time in adult silences, listening for meaning in things that weren't said. "That's a good answer," she said. "Thank you." "Most grown-ups say it goes away," Emma said. "That's not true, and they know it." Clara looked at her. This child, she thought. This careful, watchful, lonely child. "No," she said. "It's not. Emma nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her stirring. And Clara turned back to because she needed a moment that didn't have a 7-year-old looking into it, and she pressed the back of her hand against her sternum, briefly, just briefly, as though she could hold in place the thing that was trying to shift around in there. It was a Friday evening in late November when Callahan came to the kitchen. Not to collect something, not to relay an instruction through Reed, but to come himself after supper was cleared, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet, and to stand in the doorway, the way a man stands when he's not sure whether he's welcome, but has decided to come anyway. Clara looked up from the mending she was doing by the fire, one of Emma's dresses, a seam that had come loose. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He stood there for a moment. "I wanted to—" He stopped, started again. "Reed tells me you've been managing the supply budget considerably under the previous allowance. He wanted me to authorize an increase. I told him I wanted to talk to you about it directly." "I've found some inefficiencies," Clara said. "We were buying certain things in quantities that led to waste. I rearranged the rotation. It's saving approximately 30 cents a week." Callahan looked at her. "30 cents, he said. "It adds up." He was quiet for a moment. He came further into the kitchen, not all the way, but past the threshold, and looked around the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My wife used to say that," he said. It came out unexpectedly, like something that slipped through a gap he hadn't known was there. "That it adds up." Clara was very still. Callahan seemed to hear what he'd said. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it closed slightly, not unkindly, but the way a door closes when a draft moves through. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that I appreciate the work you've done here. Emma is—" He paused. "She's been better. Since you came. She's been better." "She's a remarkable child," Clara said. "You've raised someone with real character." Something moved across his face at that. Quick and then gone. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Good night, Mr. Callahan." He went back through the door. Clara sat by the fire with Emma's dress in her hands, and the needle threaded and still, and she listened to his footsteps cross the porch and the main door close, and she thought about a man who had forgotten how to talk about his wife until an accidental sentence let it out, and then pulled it back in before it could go any further. She thought about what that kind of loneliness looked like from the inside. She set down the dress. She picked it up again. She kept sewing. She was the cook. That was all she was. She kept that fact in front of her the way you kept a lamp in front of you when you were walking somewhere in the dark. Not because the dark wasn't real, but because you had to keep your eyes on the light, or you'd lose the path entirely. December arrived the way it always did in that part of the territory, without ceremony, without warning, with a cold that got into everything, and the particular silence of snow on open ground that made the world feel both larger and more enclosed at the same time. Clara had been at Callahan Ranch for exactly 7 weeks. She had learned the names of all 32 ranch hands and most of their preferences at the table. She had fixed the north window that let in the draft-sourced good-quality winter vegetables from a farm 3 miles east and established a bread schedule that meant there was always something warm available without her having to maintain a fire at hours that made the work unsustainable. Dutch Marsh had taken to stopping by the kitchen in the late afternoon, on days when the weather was poor, ostensibly for coffee. Actually, she suspected for the company, though neither of them would have described it that way. Cody, the young hand who had been the first through her door that first morning, had started bringing small things. A bundle of dried herbs. Someone in his family had sent once a jar of preserves from a general store run, and leaving them on the kitchen step, without explanation or acknowledgement. And Emma came every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, arriving at exactly 2 o'clock with her hair done with varying degrees of success, and her lesson notebook tucked under her arm, because she had decided somewhere in the preceding weeks that cooking lessons were actually also arithmetic lessons and language lessons and lessons about the why of things. And she approached them with the focused ambition of someone who understood instinctively that information was a form of power. Clara watched all of this and said nothing about it to anyone. She was making a life inside a life that wasn't technically hers. She knew it. She was careful with that knowledge. She carried it the way you carry something borrowed, with the constant awareness that it could be asked back at any moment. Because nothing here belonged to her. Not the kitchen, not the warmth of it, not the feeling of being at 32 degrees in the first week of December. Somewhere that felt against all reason and all evidence and all the accumulated experience of 25 years of other people's assessments, something that rhymed dangerously with home. She was the cook. She had $4.60 in her coat pocket and a letter from a banker in Willow Creek and a mother 11 days in the ground. That was who she was. She was the cook. She kept saying it. She kept saying it because she needed it to be the most important true thing. But the fire burned in the hearth, and Emma's dress hung mended on the hook by the door, and somewhere in the main house. Wyatt Callahan was sitting in the quiet with his particular kind of loneliness, and Clara Whitmore sat in her kitchen and listened to the snow come down and thought, I didn't come here to marry anyone. And that was true. It was absolutely completely true. But the heart, she was beginning to understand, was not a reliable keeper of boundaries that the mind had set without consulting it. And the snow kept falling, and the fire kept burning. And in 7 weeks, without her permission and without her planning, something had begun that she did not yet have a name for, but that she could feel quietly and persistently, and with growing certainty, the way you feel a change in weather before the sky has shown you anything yet. Something had begun. And Clara Whitmore, who had come to Callahan Ranch with $4.60 and a rule she had made for herself on the long wagon ride east, sat in the warmth of her own fire and understood with a clarity that frightened her a little that the hardest part was not yet behind her. The hardest part, she suspected, was still ahead. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when the trouble started. Not the slow, quiet kind of trouble that builds so gradually. You don't notice it until you're already in the middle of it. This was the kind that arrived with a face and a voice and an audience, which was always the worst kind, because it gave you nowhere to put your dignity while it was happening. Clara had been at Callahan Ranch for 9 weeks. In 9 weeks, she had fed 32 men twice a day, without a single complaint about the food, had kept the kitchen budget 30 cents a week. Under allocation had taught Emma Callahan to make apple cake, cornbread biscuits that rose properly, and the beginning stages of a beef stew that the 7-year-old had declared scientific because of the way the flavors changed depending on what you added and when. She had fixed the north window, reorganized the root cellar, and established a supply rotation that meant they would not run short of anything critical before the January wagon run. She had done all of this without asking for recognition and without receiving much. She had also, without meaning to and without wanting to become someone that a collection of people on this ranch would have described if asked quietly, privately, without feeling like they were saying something foolish as necessary. Not the cook, not the woman in the kitchen. Necessary. She didn't know that yet, but she was about to find out what it meant to someone who did not want her to be. It was Dutch who told her first on the 3rd morning of the snowfall, when he came to the kitchen before the other hands were up and sat down at the far end of the work table with his coffee and his folded hands and the expression of a man who had decided to say something unpleasant because the alternative was worse. Lawson girl sent a letter, he said. Clara kept her hands moving over the biscuit dough. To Mr. Callahan. To 4 people in town and 1 woman at the church who tells everything she knows to everyone she meets within 48 hours. Dutch looked at his coffee. Letter says, well, it doesn't say anything outright. That's the craft of it. It implies. Asks certain questions. Wonders aloud about certain things. What things? Clara said. Whether a man with a young daughter ought to have a woman of uncertain reputation living on his property. Dutch paused. Whether the arrangement might be irregular. Clara pressed the dough flat. She pressed it harder than she needed to. Uncertain reputation, she said. Her words. Based on what specifically? Dutch looked at her. Based on nothing specific. That's the point. When you can't find a real reason, you manufacture a general one and let people fill in the details themselves. People are real creative when you give them a little room. Clara cut the biscuits in clean, even circles and laid them on the pan. What does Mr. Callahan know about this? She asked. That's the other thing. Dutch set down his cup. Reed got the letter this morning. From Pruitt at the bank, forwarded it out. Seems Lawson sent him a copy too. Reed's deciding whether to bring it to Wyatt or handle it himself. He should bring it to Mr. Callahan, Clara said immediately. Dutch looked at her with something like approval. That's what I told him. Because if Mr. Callahan hears about it from someone else first, it looks like it was being managed around him. And that's worse. Yes, Dutch said. It is. Clara slid the biscuit pan toward the hearth. She stood up and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Dutch directly. Is there anything in that letter that's true? She asked. Dutch met her eyes. No. Then let Reed bring it to Mr. Callahan, she said, and let me do my job. That's all I can do. Dutch nodded once, stood, picked up his hat. For what it's worth, he said at the door, and then he stopped like a man who had started a sentence he hadn't planned all the way through and had to decide whether to finish it. It for what it's worth, he said again more quietly. I've worked for Wyatt Callahan for 11 years. I've seen how he treats people he doesn't respect, and I've seen how he treats you. He put his hat on. They're not the same. He walked out. Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the snow and said nothing. Then she went back to work. Reed brought the letter to Callahan that afternoon. She knew because she heard them, not the words but the tone. Callahan's voice through the wall of the main house, low and precise in the way it got when he was holding something in place with considerable effort. Reed's voice, quieter, briefer. Then silence. Then Callahan again, one sentence spoken with a kind of flat finality that Clara could not hear but could feel through the wood and the plaster. Then the sound of boots crossing the porch, and then the kitchen door opening. She turned from the stove. Callahan stood in the doorway holding the letter. He was still in his work coat, which meant he had come directly from wherever he and Reed had been when Reed gave it to him. His expression was the one she had learned to read in 9 weeks, the careful, contained expression of a man who had decided not to decide anything until he had all the information. Miss Whitmore, he said, I need to ask you something directly. All right, she said. Has anyone on this ranch, any of the hands, Reed, anyone treated you in a manner that could be characterized as... He paused, and she could see him choosing the word with precision, improper. No, she said immediately and without hesitation. Not once. He watched her. Has anyone attempted to... No, Mr. Callahan. She kept her voice even. Every man on this ranch has treated me with complete decency. Whatever that letter implies, it has nothing to do with anything that has happened on this property. Callahan looked at the letter in his hand. He looked at it the way you look at something you are working out whether to crumple or keep. Victoria Lawson, he said, is a woman who is accustomed to getting what she wants. Clara said nothing. She has wanted, he said carefully, certain things for some time. I have not been in a position, or rather, I have not been willing. He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of sentence easy, and Clara could see the effort of it. I have made my position clear to her, I believed. Apparently, I was not clear enough. Mr. Callahan, Clara said, you don't need to explain your personal situation to me. I'm not explaining it, he said. I'm telling you that what's in this letter is not about you. It's about me refusing something she wanted and her finding the nearest available target to make the refusal costly. He looked up. You don't deserve to be that target. Clara felt something move in her chest, quick and complicated, and something she did not have the luxury of examining right now. What are you going to do about it? She asked. I've already sent Reed to speak to Pruitt, Callahan said, and I intend to speak to Victoria myself. He looked at her steadily. Your position here is not in question. I want you to know that. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He started to turn. Mr. Callahan, she said. He stopped. The letter implies that my being here is irregular, she said. I want to ask you directly whether you believe that. Whether given the talk you would prefer that I... No, he said. Flat. Unambiguous. No hesitation. I would not. He walked out. Clara turned back to the stove. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the iron surface, not long enough to burn, just long enough to feel something solid and real. She steadied herself. She kept cooking. Tofe. The talk reached the church the following Sunday, which meant by Monday morning it had reached every household in Willow Creek that received news through the church network, which was most of them. Clara knew this because Emma told her. Emma arrived at the kitchen on Tuesday at 2 o'clock exactly on time as always, but with her small face arranged into an expression that was doing a great deal of work to contain something she had not yet decided whether to say. She sat down at the work table. She put her notebook in front of her. She opened it to a blank page. Then she looked at Clara. "Mrs. Holt was at church Sunday," she said. Clara said. "She said things about you. To Mrs. Pierce and Mrs. Abbott." Emma's voice was careful, the voice of a child who has learned to manage information. "I heard some of it. I wasn't supposed to." Clara set down what she was holding and gave Emma her full attention. "What did she say?" Clara asked. Emma looked at the blank page in her notebook. "She said you came here because you had no other options, that you were taking advantage of Papa because he was lonely." She paused. "She said a woman who looked like you ought to be grateful anyone gave her a position at all." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara breathed. "Emma," she said, "look at me." Emma looked up. "People say things about other people," Clara said slowly. "Sometimes because they're afraid, sometimes because someone else told them to, sometimes because it makes them feel larger to make someone else feel smaller. None of those reasons make the things true." Emma's jaw was set. "I know they're not true." "How do you know?" "Because," Emma said with the precision of a child who has thought this through very carefully, "you're the first person since Mama died who fixed things. Not just kitchen things. Just things." She pressed her lips together. "Papa smiles now sometimes. He didn't used to." Clara did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "Emma," she said finally. "What?" "Your father smiling has nothing to do with me," Clara said carefully. "That's him. That's who he is when he lets himself be." Emma looked at her steadily. "Then why didn't he let himself be until you came?" Clara had no answer for that. She looked at this 7-year-old child with her father's dark eyes, and her too old understanding, and her absolute lack of interest in being told comfortable things that weren't true. And she thought this child is going to be extraordinary. And someone ought to tell her that. "Can we make something today?" Emma asked in the abrupt way she had of changing the subject when she'd said what she needed to say. "Not cake. Something harder." "How hard?" Clara said. "Something I have to concentrate on," Emma said. "I don't want to think about Mrs. Holt." "Then we'll make pastry crust," Clara said. "It requires complete concentration or it falls apart." Emma nodded. She picked up her pencil. "Tell me the why first," she said. And Clara told her the why, and they worked side by side in the warm kitchen while the snow fell outside and Clara watched Emma's small hands follow instructions with fierce determination, and she did not think about Mrs. Holt or Victoria Lawson, or the letter, or what people were saying in town. She thought about the pastry crust. She thought about this child. She thought about how survival sometimes looked like two people standing at a kitchen table making something with their hands while the world outside made its noise. The crust came out well. Emma looked at it with intense satisfaction. "We should make it for Papa," she said. "We should," Clara agreed. She had been at the ranch for 11 weeks when Dutch Marsh got hurt. It happened on a Wednesday morning a horse that spooked a fence post in the wrong place. Dutch's shoulder taking the impact of something that left him unable to lift his right arm above the level of his chest. The ranch doctor came out from town, pronounced nothing broken but considerable damage to the joint, and instructed Dutch to rest the arm for a minimum of 2 weeks. Dutch received this instruction with the expression of a man being told to breathe underwater. Clara found him sitting on the bunkhouse step that afternoon, wrapped in his coat, staring at his right hand, with the particular fury of a person for whom being useful was not a preference, but a fundamental requirement of self. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He didn't look up. She sat down on the step beside him, which she had never done before, and he looked at her sideways with mild surprise. "It was a stupid accident," he said. "Most of them are. I've worked this ranch 11 years, never a serious injury." He flexed the fingers of his right hand experimentally. Winced. Now I'm sitting here useless while Cody tries to manage the east fence line, which he can't, because Cody is good with cattle and hopeless with fence line. He'll learn, Clara said. He'll learn too slow. Dutch turned and looked at her directly. You know Wyatt came to see me this morning before I'd even gotten off the ground. Came himself, not Reed. That sounds like him, Clara said. Told me I'd still draw full wages during the rest period. Dutch shook his head. 11 years, and I still... He stopped, looked at his hand again. You know what kind of man does that? Comes himself, doesn't send someone. A man who knows how to treat people, Clara said. Dutch was quiet for the moment. When I first saw you, he said, I thought what most of the hands thought. Woman your size turning up alone, taking a position this isolated. I thought I knew what that meant. Clara said nothing. I was wrong, Dutch said. It came out flat and direct in the way of a man who did not apologize easily, and therefore made sure it counted when he did. I was wrong, and I want you to know I know it. Clara looked out at the snow. You were working with the information you had, she said. That's generous. It's accurate, she said. People make assumptions based on what they've seen before. The only thing that changes it is seeing something different. She paused. You saw something different. Dutch looked at her. You're a hell of a woman, Miss Whitmore, he said. I mean that respectfully. I know you do, she said. You should let me look at that shoulder. I've dealt with joint injuries before in the bakery occupational hazard. There are some things that help with the swelling. Dutch looked at his shoulder, then at her, then back at his shoulder. All right, he said with the air of a man conceding a point he'd been planning to argue. She got the supplies from the kitchen and tended to his shoulder with the same focused competence she brought to everything. And Dutch sat still and let her work and said nothing, and neither of them mentioned the fact that this was the first time since she arrived that she had been asked to do something that had nothing to do with cooking. She was becoming, without planning it, and without announcing it, something larger than her job description. She hadn't decided what to do about that yet. It was the last Saturday of December when Callahan found her in the kitchen at midnight. She had not been able to sleep. This happened sometimes, her mind running through the kind of accounting that had no numbers, the particular arithmetic of her situation, the way things were adding up in directions she hadn't planned for. She had come to the kitchen because the kitchen was the place that made the most sense to her, and she was sitting at the work table with a cup of cold coffee and her mother's old ledger open in front of her. Not the financial one, but the other one. The recipe book that doubled as a diary, that doubled as the closest thing she had to a conversation with someone who no longer existed. The door opened. She looked up. Callahan stood in the doorway in his work clothes, which meant he also had not been sleeping. They looked at each other for a moment. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Callahan, she said. He came in. He went to the stove, checked the coffee, found it long cold, and built the fire back up with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, which he probably had. He made a fresh pot. He did all of this without asking whether she wanted any, because the answer was obvious, and neither of them was the kind of person who asked questions with obvious answers. He sat down on the far end of the work table bench, not close, but not distant. The correct distance. He looked at the ledger. Your mother's, he said. Yes. He nodded. He didn't ask more than that, which she appreciated. The coffee percolated. The fire burned up again. The snow outside had stopped for the first time in days, and the silence had that particular quality of the world after a long storm, held and clean and very still. I owe you an apology, Callahan said. Clara looked at him. For what? For not handling the Lawson situation before it reached the point of that letter. He looked at the table. I knew I've known for some time what her intentions were, and I was, he paused, avoidant. It was easier to be unclear than to be direct, and you paid the cost of that. The letter didn't cost me much, Clara said carefully. It cost you your reputation in town, he said, which is not a small thing, particularly not for a woman in your position who doesn't have the... He stopped. who doesn't have the protection of a family name or a husband to defend her. Clara said, finishing it plainly. You can say it, Mr. Callahan. It's accurate. He looked at her. I spoke to Victoria 2 days ago, he said. I was direct. It won't happen again. What did you say to her? Something crossed his face, not quite humor, but in the same county. I said that Miss Whitmore's conduct on this ranch has been beyond reproach, that any further letters of the kind she'd been sending would result in my notifying her father of the full contents, and that she was not welcome on this property until she had acknowledged to the people she'd spoken to that her characterizations were unfounded. Clara stared at him. You said that, she said. Ed, I said that. To Victoria Lawson. To Victoria Lawson. He looked at her steadily. Was that overstepping? Clara thought about this for a genuine moment. A man defending her reputation not because she'd asked, not because she was helpless, but because she deserved it, and he had finally decided to act like it. No, she said. It wasn't. He nodded. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup that she had poured and slid toward him while they were talking, without either of them noting the moment it happened. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Why are you still here? She blinked. I beg your pardon. After everything, he said. The letter, the talk, the isolation. You have skills that would serve you in a dozen places that would be easier than this. Why are you still here? Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the answers that were partly true. The debt, the lack of alternatives, the $4.60. She thought about the way Emma's face looked when the pastry crust came out well, and the way Dutch had said, "You're a hell of a woman," like he was paying a debt, and the way this kitchen felt at 5:15 in the morning when the fire was burning and the coffee was ready and the world had not yet started making its demands. Because this is the first place, she said slowly, where I've been given a job and then judged on whether I did it. Not on what I look like or where I came from or what I don't have, just on whether the work is good. Callahan was quiet. The work is good, he said. I know, she said. And for the first time in 9 weeks, she said it without any qualification in her voice. Not I think so or I hope so. Just I know. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. Something that was not admiration exactly, because admiration had a kind of distance in it, a looking at. This was something else. Something that was looking at her and also recognizing something. Your mother, he said. What was she like? The question landed softly, unexpectedly, like the first snow of a season, not violent, just present. She was the most practical woman I've ever known, Clara said. She never said anything she didn't mean. She never wasted a thing. She could look at a situation and tell you in one sentence exactly what the problem was, and one sentence what to do about it. She paused. I spent 25 years thinking I'd never be as clear-headed as she was, and then she died, and I realized I'd learned it without noticing. Callahan turned the coffee cup in his hands. My wife was like that, he said. And this time, he didn't pull it back. She was direct. She said things plainly. I used to argue with her because I thought she was being harsh, and she'd look at me and say, Wyatt, harsh is when something isn't true. I'm just telling you what is. He stopped. I've been hearing her say that in my head for 6 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara understood that she was hearing something that didn't get said often. That possibly it didn't get said at all to anyone, and that it was being said now because it was midnight and the snow had stopped, and they were 2 people alone in a kitchen with hot coffee, and the particular honesty that comes when the rest of the world is asleep. She sounds like someone I would have liked, Clara said. She would have liked you, Callahan said. And then, as if startled by his own certainty, I think. Clara smiled, just slightly. That might be the finest compliment I've received since I arrived, she said. He looked at her. And something shifted in his face. Not sudden, not dramatic, but the way a weight shifts when you've been carrying it so long, you've forgotten it could be set down. Just a shift. An easing. Like a door that had been stuck in its frame, finally finding the right angle to open. He stood up. Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore, he said. You'll be up before 4. I know, she said. He stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. Clara, he said, Not Miss Whitmore, just Clara. She went still. I'm glad you didn't leave, he said. Then he walked out. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, with the fire burning and the coffee cooling, and her mother's ledger open in front of her, and she did not move for a long time. She was thinking about the way her name had sounded in his voice. She was thinking about a man who had spent 6 years carrying a dead woman's clarity in his head like a compass. She was thinking about a lot of things she had no business thinking about. She closed the ledger. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about how the heart was the most undisciplined thing a person owned, and how it would follow where it chose to go without once asking permission, and how she had made a rule on the wagon ride east, a clear, reasonable, necessary rule, and how that rule was becoming with each passing week harder and harder to enforce. She was the cook. She pressed her eyes shut. She was the cook. January came in cold and clear, and with it came the cattle buyers from Abilene. 3 men, well-dressed and well-fed, who arrived with an air of authority that came from knowing they were the ones holding the money. Clara had them at the main house table for supper the first evening, serving a meal she had spent 2 days on, not because she had been asked to, but because she understood without being told that this dinner mattered to the ranch in ways that had nothing to do with food. She could hear them through the wall while she worked in the kitchen, keeping the serving dishes warm. Callahan's voice different from his usual register. Not warmer, not friendlier, but more precise, more deliberate. The voice of a man who negotiated with both eyes open. The buyer named Garrett was doing most of the talking. He had a laugh that arrived at the wrong moments, and Clara had identified him within the first hour as the kind of man who mistook loudness for strength. Your operation has a good reputation, Callahan, Garrett said. But the market's shifted. We're looking at a lower opening than last season. That's not what you paid Kendrick over in Lincoln County, Callahan said. A pause. Kendrick's herd had stronger grade in Mia. Kendrick's grade report is public record, Callahan said. So is mine. Side by side they tell a particular story, and it's not the one you're telling me right now. Silence. Then Garrett's laugh, different this time, less confident. You've done your research. I generally do. Clara allowed herself a small private satisfaction at the sound of that and went back to the stove. She sent Emma in with the bread, which she had been taught to do with correct timing and correct manner. And she listened to Emma, 7 years old. Her father's daughter set the basket on the table and say in her precise and serious way, "Papa says the bread's best warm. You should eat it now." There was a moment of surprised silence from the buyers, and then Garrett laughed genuinely. This time not the loud wrong laugh, and said, "She's something, Callahan." "Yes," Callahan said. "She is." The deal they reached 2 days later was 10 cents per head above what Garrett had opened with. Clara didn't know the exact figures, but she knew from the way Reed stood taller that afternoon and the way Dutch, still carrying his arm carefully against his side, smiled when he heard the news that it had gone well. Callahan came to the kitchen that evening. He stood in the doorway. "Supper last night mattered," he said. "I want you to know that." "I'm glad it was useful," Clara said. He looked at her steadily. "It wasn't useful," he said. "It was excellent. There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment. "There is," she agreed. He nodded. He left. She stood very still for a moment after he was gone, and she thought, this is how it happens. Not in one large moment. Not in a declaration or a revelation. It happens in 10 cents per head, and a breadbasket delivered by a 7-year-old, and a man standing in your kitchen doorway, making a distinction between useful and excellent, like it was the most important distinction in the world. This was how it happened, and she was in considerable trouble. It was Dutch of all people who said it out loud first. He had been back at partial work for a week, his shoulder improving, but not cleared for full strain, and he had gotten into the habit of stopping by the kitchen in the early evening for coffee, and increasingly for the kind of conversation that didn't require either of them to pretend they were discussing something other than what they were discussing. "You know what the hands call him now," Dutch said. "What?" Clara said. "The man who smiles at supper," Dutch said. "Cody started it. None of them have seen Callahan smile at the table before. Not once in 4 years, some of them. He looked at his cup. They think it's the food. Clara said nothing. It's not the food, Dutch said. Mr. Marsh, I'm not asking you anything, he said calmly. I'm just telling you what I see, an old man's privilege. He drank his coffee. He's been carrying something for a long time. It got heavier after Martha died. I watched it get heavier every year. And then you came here and it got lighter. He set down the cup. That's a fact, not an opinion. I've got 11 years of comparison data. Clara kept her hands flat on the table. Even if that's true, she said carefully, that's not. I know, Dutch said. I know what you're going to say. You're the cook. This is your job. You're not here for any other reason. He looked at her. Are you still saying that because it's true, or because you're afraid? The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at the table. She looked at her hands. Both, she said. Honest. Flat. Both. Dutch nodded. He stood up. Fear's reasonable, he said. I'd be worried about a woman who wasn't afraid in your position, but, he picked up his hat, a woman who stays afraid when she doesn't have to anymore, that's a different kind of waste. He walked out. Clara sat alone in the kitchen. She thought about fear. She thought about what Dutch had said when she doesn't have to anymore, and she thought about all the ways that was not yet true. All the ways her situation was still as precarious as it had been the day she walked through the gate with $4.60 and a rule she had made for herself. And then she thought about the way Callahan had said her name. Just her name. Clara. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had been the cook for 11 weeks. She had never wanted to be anything else. She had never wanted to be anything else. She kept saying it. It was getting harder to mean. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Not a letter like the one Victoria had sent to the church women, careful, implicative, wrapped in false concern. This one was direct. It came addressed to Wyatt Callahan at Callahan Ranch on paper that cost more than most men in the county spent on a week's meals, and it bore the return mark of Lawson Holdings, which was what Victoria's father called his operation when he wanted to remind people how large it was. Clara didn't see the letter. But she heard what it said because by Friday morning, Dutch knew, and by Friday afternoon, Cody knew, and by Friday evening, the entire bunkhouse knew, and the bunkhouse was separated from the kitchen by one wall and approximately 12 inches of wood and plaster. Gerald Lawson had written to Wyatt Callahan to inform him that the grazing agreement between Lawson Holdings and Callahan Ranch, a long-standing arrangement that gave Callahan access to the eastern water source during dry months, would not be renewed in the spring. The reason given was a dispute over fencing. Everyone on the ranch knew it had nothing to do with fencing. Clara knew it had nothing to do with fencing from the moment she heard Dutch say the word fencing in a tone that meant the complete opposite of fencing. She went about her work. She said nothing. She kept the fire burning and the food on the table, and she watched Callahan through the window of her own careful attention, the way she had learned to watch things that mattered without making the watching obvious. How was different on Friday? Not visibly, not in any way that the casual observer would have named. But she had been studying him for 11 weeks, the way you study a language you haven't been taught formally, but have been absorbing through proximity, and she could read the grammar of him now in ways she hadn't planned for and couldn't undo. He was angrier than he was showing. He was also beneath the anger worried. She understood why. By Saturday morning, when Reed came to the kitchen under the pretext of checking the supply ledger and told her with the directness of a man who had decided she was someone worth keeping, informed that the eastern water source was not optional. During the July dry season, without access to that water, Callahan's herd would have to be reduced by a third or driven 40 miles to alternate grazing, which was neither practical nor economical. Gerald Lawson knows that, Reed said. Of course he does, Clara said. This is Victoria, Reed said. This is her asking her father to do what she can't do herself. Clara set down the supply ledger. Can Mr. Callahan negotiate another arrangement with the eastern water holders? She asked. There aren't any other eastern water holders. Lawson bought out the Hendersons 2 years ago. He's the only option within reasonable distance. Clara thought about this. What about the Henderson brothers themselves? She asked. Where did they go after the sale? Reed looked at her. They're ranching up near Mill Haven. Why? Because men who sell under pressure often sell things they didn't want to sell, Clara said. And men who didn't want to sell sometimes have long memories about why they had to. Reed stared at her for a moment. You think the Hendersons would help, he said slowly. I think it's worth knowing whether Gerald Lawson bought that land at a price the Hendersons considered fair, Clara said, and whether the Hendersons might have opinions about how that land is now being used as leverage. Reed was quiet for a long moment. I'll mention it to Wyatt, he said. You should, Clara said. She picked up the supply ledger again. Mention it as your own idea. It'll land better. Reed looked at her with an expression she had seen before on Dutch's face. The look of a man revising something he thought he knew. He didn't argue. He left. 2 days later, Callahan rode to Mill Haven. He didn't tell Clara he was going. He didn't tell anyone except Reed. But she noticed the absence the way you notice when a sound you've gotten used to suddenly stops. Not dramatically. Just an absence where presence had been. Emma noticed too. Papa went somewhere, Emma said on Tuesday, arriving at the kitchen at her customary 2 o'clock with her notebook and a frown between her brows. Reed says it's ranch business. Ranch business always means something went wrong. Your father handles things that go wrong very well, Clara said. I know, Emma said, but the frown didn't move. But he didn't say goodbye this morning. He just left. He always says goodbye. Clara stopped what she was doing. She looked at Emma, the small, fierce, carefully controlled face of a child who had spent 6 years being the only person in her father's household who had learned to manage her own fear by managing information, who understood at 7 years old that the world could remove people without warning, and that the only defense against that knowledge was routine. Wyatt had said goodbye every single morning, without exception, and this morning he hadn't. Emma, Clara said. Come here. Emma came. She stood in front of Clara with her chin up and her eyes very bright. Your father is fine, Clara said. He rode out on important business, and he'll be back by Thursday at the latest. I know because Reed told me this morning. She hadn't known until this second, but Reed had said Wyatt rode at dawn, and she was reasonably certain that if there were real danger involved, Reed would not have delivered the information while simultaneously reviewing the hay allocation. He forgot to say goodbye because he had his mind on the problem he was going to solve. Not because anything is wrong. Emma looked at her. How do you know it was forgetting and not something else? She asked. Clara held her gaze. Because your father is a man who says goodbye to his daughter every morning. That is not the kind of habit a man breaks unless something very large interrupts him. And something interrupting a habit is not the same as the habit being gone. Emma processed this. All right, she said finally. All right, Clara said. Now, we're making something more complicated today. Emma's chin came up half an inch. How complicated? Very, Clara said. Pie crust with a lattice top. It requires patience and geometry. Emma sat down and opened her notebook. Teach me the geometry first, she said. And that was that. Callahan came back on Wednesday evening, not Thursday. He rode in at dusk, handed his horse to Cody, and walked directly to the kitchen. Clara heard the boots on the porch and turned from the stove, and he came through the door, looking like a man who had ridden hard and eaten poorly and slept in worse conditions than usual, which for Wyatt Callahan meant conditions most men would consider genuinely harsh. He sat down at the work table without asking whether he could. She put coffee in front of him without being asked. Henderson Brothers, he said. And, she said, Gerald Lawson paid them 60 cents for that land, he said. Cash offer, time pressure, no other buyers at the table, he made sure of that. Henry Henderson has been wanting to talk about it to someone with standing for 2 years. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He's willing to make a statement to the county land office about the circumstances of the sale. He's also willing to file a formal record of the price differential and the methods used, which, depending on who reads it, could create problems for Lawson Holdings' other land arrangements in the county. Clara kept her expression neutral. Will that be enough? Enough to give Lawson a reason to reconsider the water arrangement. Yes. He looked at her. Enough to make him cooperative permanently, no. But it buys time, and it shifts the position. He'll negotiate rather than dictate, which is all I need right now. Good, Clara said. Callahan looked at her steadily. Reed told me whose idea the Hendersons were. Clara said nothing. He said it was his, Callahan said. But he also told me specifically and clearly that it was not his, because he said the person it belonged to deserved to have that known. Clara looked at the table. It was a reasonable inference, she said. It was a good piece of thinking, Callahan said. It solved a problem I'd been turning over for 2 days and hadn't cracked. He paused. Thank you. She looked up. I was watching her with that look again, the one that was not admiration, not quite, but something adjacent to it, and deeper. The look that recognized something. You're welcome, she said. He finished the coffee. He stood. Emma, he said. She's fine, Clara said. She was worried Tuesday. I told her you'd be back by Thursday. Something crossed his face. I didn't say goodbye Tuesday morning. I know. He stopped. I had my mind on the problem. I told her that, Clara said. I told her that's what it was. He looked at her. Was that the right thing to tell her? He asked, not rhetorically, genuinely, as though her answer mattered. Yes, Clara said. She needed. The absence was about the problem, not about her. Children that age make themselves the cause of things that have nothing to do with them. It's what they do. Callahan was quiet for a moment. You understand her, he said. She's not difficult to understand, Clara said. She's very much like you. She just hasn't had as long to practice managing it. Something in his face moved quick and complicated something that he drew back before it could go all the way to the surface. He put on his hat. I'll say good night to her, he said. She'll be awake, Clara said. She always knows when you're back. I don't know how, but she does. He almost smiled. I know, he said. She always has. He walked out, and Clara stood at the stove and listened to his boots cross the porch and the main door open, and Emma's voice from somewhere in the house, high and immediate and completely unguarded. The voice she kept for her father, only saying something Clara couldn't hear clearly, and then Callahan's voice in return, low and quiet, and something in it that was entirely different from any register Clara had heard him use with anyone else. She turned back to the stove. She stirred the pot. She thought, this is what you don't get to have. And then she thought, but you already have some of it. Already. Whether you meant to or not. And she didn't know, standing there in the warm kitchen with the fire burning and the snow long since gone, and February coming in with cold, clear air, whether that was something to be grateful for or something to be frightened of. She settled on both. Both seemed accurate. The confrontation, when it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Not Victoria, not Gerald Lawson, not Pruitt at the bank, or Mrs. Holt at the church, or any of the people who had been assembling their opinions of her since October. It came from a woman named Agnes Fowler, who was 60 years old and ran the Willow Creek Ladies Auxiliary, and who had apparently decided that the situation at Callahan Ranch had gone on long enough without her direct involvement. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in February without advance notice, which was itself a statement. People who arrived without advance notice were people who wanted to see what they found, rather than what you'd had time to prepare. And Agnes Fowler had been making unannounced visits to situations she disapproved of for 30 years. She didn't ask for Callahan. She asked for Clara. Reed, who happened to be crossing the yard when her buggy arrived, came to the kitchen to inform Clara that she had a visitor, and in the carefully constructed neutrality of his tone, Clara heard everything she needed to know about how this visit was likely to go. She wiped her hands on her apron. She went to the front of the house. Agnes Fowler was a small woman with white hair and the posture of someone who had decided 40 years ago that she was right about most things and had found sufficient evidence since to maintain that conviction. She stood in the main room without sitting because she hadn't been invited to sit yet, which was itself a calculation. Standing meant the conversation would be short. Miss Whitmore, she said. Mrs. Fowler, Clara said. Can I offer you coffee? No. Agnes looked at her with the particular scrutiny of a woman who was doing a rapid and comprehensive assessment. "I'll be direct with you because I prefer it. People in this county have been talking about your situation here for 4 months. I generally don't involve myself in gossip. However, when a situation moves from gossip to community concern, I consider that my responsibility." "What's the community concern?" Clara asked. "You are an unmarried woman living under the roof of an unmarried man," Agnes said, "with a child present. Whatever the technical arrangement of your quarters, the situation creates an impression that is not helpful for Mr. Callahan's standing, not helpful for the child's reputation as she grows, and not helpful for yours." Clara looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Fowler," she said, "with respect, I am employed at this ranch. I do the work of my employment. I am paid for that work. My quarters have a private entrance that I use exclusively. There is nothing about this arrangement that would require comment if I were a man." "But you are not a man," Agnes said. "And that is exactly the point." "Yes," Clara said. "And the fact that my work is identical in nature but generates entirely different community concern because of my sex is precisely the problem I'm identifying." Agnes blinked. Once. Then again. The expression of a woman who had arrived expecting one kind of conversation and found another. "You're not what I expected," Agnes said. "People rarely are," Clara said. A pause. Agnes looked around the room. She looked back at Clara. "You're not trying to trap Wyatt Callahan," Agnes said. It came out less like an accusation and more like a conclusion she was reaching in real time. "I came here to work," Clara said. "That is the beginning and the end of my intentions." "And yet—" Agnes stopped. "And yet, what Mrs. Fowler?" Agnes looked at her for a long, considering moment. "The child," she said more quietly. "Emma. She speaks of you." "I'm glad she has things to say," Clara said carefully. "She told Reverend Pearson's wife that you taught her how to tell the difference between sadness that's hiding and sadness that's pretending to be gone." Agnes's voice had changed, less formal, something more real in it. "She said you told her sadness gets quieter, but not gone like a smaller fire. She said nobody told her that before." Clara said nothing. "What kind of woman," Agnes said, "who is here only to work, takes the time to tell a motherless child the truth about grief?" The question hung in the room. Clara met Agnes Fowler's eyes. "The kind of woman," Clara said, "who needed someone to tell her that too when she was 7. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Agnes Fowler looked at Clara for a very long moment. Then she sat down, not because she'd been invited, but because the conversation had shifted into territory that required sitting. "Wyatt Callahan," Agnes said quietly, "has been alone for a long time. And he is not a man who makes poor decisions. He is a man who makes no decisions when he's afraid of the cost." She folded her hands in her lap. "I came here today because I expected to find something that needed correcting. I find instead—" She paused. "I find a situation that may be more complicated than it appeared from town." "It generally is," Clara said. Agnes stood again. She smoothed her skirt. She looked at Clara with something that had traveled a significant distance from where it started. "I will not be adding my voice to Mrs. Holt's," she said, "for whatever that is worth." "It's worth quite a lot," Clara said. Agnes Fowler put on her gloves. She walked to the door. She stopped. "Miss Whitmore," she said with her back to the room, "the auxiliary meets the first Thursday of each month. If you ever wish to attend, your presence would not be unwelcome." She walked out. Clara stood in the main room of Callahan's house and heard the buggy leave and stood very still for a moment. Agnes Fowler had come to deliver a warning and left without delivering it. That was not nothing. That was in the arithmetic of small frontier towns very nearly everything. Chug. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived 12 days later on a Friday afternoon in the shape of a man named Robert Whitmore, Clara's cousin. She had not seen Robert in 4 years. He was her father's brother's son, older by 6 years, serious with the family's facility for numbers and none of the family's warmth. He had not come to her mother's funeral. He had sent a letter and correct expressing condolences and asking with admirable efficiency whether Clara needed assistance liquidating the remaining estate assets. She had not replied. He arrived at Callahan Ranch in a rented buggy, with his coat buttoned to the throat against the February cold, and an expression that managed to combine genuine concern with something that was unmistakably calculation. Clara heard his voice in the yard. Reed's responding pause, then Reed coming to the kitchen to tell her with his customary careful neutrality that she had a family visitor. She went out. "Robert," she said. "Clara." He looked at her, the full assessment, the quick computation. "You look well. Better than I expected." "What did you expect?" she said. "After everything, the debt, the sale, your mother, I imagined the worst." He looked around the yard with the expression of a man pricing things. "This is a substantial operation." "What are you doing here, Robert?" she said. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I was in the county on business. Pruitt mentioned me to you," Clara said. "He said you were working out at Callahan Ranch. Given the family connection, I thought it appropriate to check in." Clara looked at her cousin with the particular clarity that came from knowing someone well enough to read the gap between what they said and what they meant. Robert had come because Pruitt had told him Clara was working at a wealthy man's ranch, and Robert had done the arithmetic on what that might eventually mean. "Robert," she said, "what do you want?" He had the grace to drop the pretense. "Almost. The debt from the estate," he said. "Pruitt tells me there's a remaining balance. I've been thinking, given your current situation, that perhaps it would be worth discussing a family arrangement. I could absorb the debt in exchange for a share of any—" He paused, choosing the word carefully, "any future assets that might reasonably be attributed to the family connection." Clara stared at him. "You want a share," she said, "of assets I haven't earned yet from a situation you're assuming I'm in based on information from a banker I did not authorize to discuss my affairs." Robert shifted. "I'm trying to help." "No," she said. "You're not." Her voice was even quiet and completely without mercy. "You didn't come to my mother's funeral. You sent a letter asking about assets. You've now ridden out here to stake a claim on a future you've invented out of gossip and arithmetic. I want you to hear me very clearly, Robert. I owe you nothing. I am owed nothing by you. And whatever you and Pruitt have been speculating about my situation here has absolutely no basis in fact." Robert's face had reddened considerably. "Clara." "I have work to do," she said. "You're welcome to warm yourself in the kitchen for 20 minutes before you head back to town. I'll make sure you have coffee. But this conversation is finished." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen. She heard Robert standing in the yard for a moment. She heard the particular sound of a man recalculating. Then she heard him follow her, not because he'd won anything, but because it was cold, and he needed somewhere to be while his dignity reassembled itself. She made him coffee. She did not speak to him beyond the basic courtesies. He left 40 minutes later without getting what he'd come for. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the buggy go and felt something cold and clean move through her. Not anger exactly, but its aftermath. The flat, clear air after a storm. She had not cried. She had not pleaded. She had not explained herself more than once. She thought about the woman who had walked into Pruitt's bank 4 months ago with a letter she was shaking too hard to keep still. Who had pressed her hand against her mouth on the far end of the boardwalk and allowed herself 30 seconds before lifting her chin. She thought about how far that woman had traveled. Not in miles. She didn't tell Callahan about Robert. But Dutch knew because Dutch had been in the yard, and Dutch told Callahan that evening in a conversation Clara was not part of, but heard the outline of through the wall, and the outline was enough. She was at the work table when Callahan came in. His expression was the controlled one, the one that meant he was keeping something at a particular temperature. "Your cousin," he said. "Yes," she said. "Reed said he came with business intentions." "He did." "Did he upset you?" And the way he asked it direct, no softening, but with something underneath the directness that was not neutral, made her look up. "No," she said. "He confirmed some things I already knew about people. That's not upsetting, it's just information." Callahan looked at her steadily. "Pruitt had no business discussing your affairs with anyone," he said. "No," she agreed. I'll speak to him. Mr. Callahan. I'll speak to him, he said again. Not an offer, a statement of intent. She looked at him. At the set of his jaw, and the particular quality of his stillness that she had learned, meant he had already decided and was informing rather than proposing. All right, she said. Something shifted in his expression, as though he had braced for an argument and been surprised when it didn't come. You're not going to tell me to leave it alone, he said. Would it change your mind? She said. No, he said. Then it would be a waste of both our time, she said. And I don't waste things. The ghost of that almost smile. No, he said. You don't. He stayed in the kitchen for another 20 minutes. Not for a reason, not for coffee or a question or ranch business. Just staying. Standing at the far end of the room, looking at the shelf she had reorganized in November, the new supply system, the dried herbs bundled and hanging from the ceiling, the mended window that no longer let in the draft. You changed this room, he said, not critically, observationally. I changed what wasn't working, she said. Most of it, he said. Most of it needed it, she said. He looked around once more. My wife organized her kitchen by smell, he said. She said it was faster than trying to remember labels. Sweet things together, savory together, sharp and bitter together. He looked at Clara's shelves. You organized yours the same way. Clara had not known that. She had organized her kitchen by smell, because it was the system that made sense to her that she had developed in her mother's kitchen at age 9, that she had never thought about as a choice, but simply as the correct way. She stood very still. Did she? Clara said. Yes, Callahan said. He was looking at the shelves. His voice was quiet and slightly distant, the way it got when he was inside a memory and speaking from the edge of it. I haven't thought about that in a while. The kitchen was warm and quiet. I'm glad you remembered, Clara said softly. He looked at her. The distance left his eyes. So am I, he said. He left. Clara stood at the work table for a long moment. She was thinking about a woman she had never met who had organized her kitchen by smell, who had told her husband that harsh was when something wasn't true, who had died and left a small girl and a man who had been getting quieter every year since. She was thinking about how strange it was that grief and connection could occupy the same moment without canceling each other out. She was thinking about a rule she had made on a wagon ride east in October in the cold, when she had $4.60 and a mother 11 days in the ground, and absolutely no intention of becoming anyone's anything. The rule was still there. She could still feel it. But it had changed shape. It was no longer a wall. It had become something smaller, a held breath maybe, the moment before a decision. She didn't know yet what she would decide, but she knew she was getting closer to having to. The letter from Victoria Lawson arrived the following Monday. Not sent quietly to church women or forwarded to bankers this time. This one was sent directly to Clara. It arrived with the supply wagon tucked among the parcels, her name written on the front in a careful and expensive hand. Clara looked at it for a moment before she opened it. Then she opened it. It was 3 sentences. Miss Whitmore, you should know that a man who allows his household to generate this kind of talk is not a man who will protect you when it matters. Leave now with your reputation intact before he gives you a reason to leave with nothing. Clara read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to work. She worked through breakfast, through the midday meal, through the afternoon. She kept the letter in her pocket, like a coal small and warm and requiring management. At 4 o'clock, Callahan crossed the yard toward the barn. She watched through the kitchen window. She made a decision. She took off her apron. She walked out to the yard. Mr. Callahan, she called. He stopped. He turned. She crossed the yard and held out the letter. I took it. He read it. His face didn't change. But something in his stillness changed, became a different kind of still, the kind that preceded a decision. She sent this to you directly, he said. Yes. She's changing tacks, he said. She's not trying to damage your reputation anymore. She's trying to make you doubt mine." "I know," Clara said. He looked up from the letter. And I don't," Clara said. He held her gaze. Something passed across his face, fast, deep, and completely unguarded. The look of a man who has been braced for doubt for so long that the absence of it has temporarily disarmed him. "Clara," he said, just her name, the way he had said it in December in the kitchen at midnight. She stood in the cold February yard and looked at Wyatt Callahan, and understood that she had crossed some line in the last 30 seconds that she was not going to be able to uncross. Not because of what she had said, because of what she had meant when she said it. She had said, "I don't doubt you." She had meant something larger than that. Something that encompassed the kitchen, and Emma and Dutch, and the smell-organized shelves, and midnight coffee, and the way he said her name, and the way the ranch felt at 5:15 in the morning, like something that was hers, even though it wasn't, even though she was the cook, even though she had made a rule. She had meant something that had no safe name yet. He looked at her like he heard it anyway. "She won't stop," he said quietly. Until you give her a reason to," Clara said. "A real one." A long silence. The wind moved between them. The cold was sharp and clear, and neither of them moved. "What kind of reason?" he said very carefully. Clara looked at him. She thought about the rule. She thought about $4.60. She thought about Dutch saying, "When you don't have to be afraid anymore." She thought about Emma saying, "Papa smiles now sometimes." She breathed. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I think we're going to have to figure that out." Callahan looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. Like a man who had been waiting for permission to move forward and had finally been given it. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat pocket. "Come to dinner tonight," he said. "At the main table, you and Emma." She blinked. I don't think that's..." "It's not irregular," he said. "It's my table and my invitation. Come to dinner, Clara." She stood in the February cold and looked at this man who had said her name again. Her name like it was simply the right word for something real, and she thought, this is the moment Dutch meant. This is the one where you either move or you don't. She breathed. "All right," she said. He nodded again. He walked toward the barn. She stood in the yard. She put her hand in her apron pocket and found the pocket empty. She had taken the apron off. She stood in the cold February yard with her hands at her sides and the rule she had made in October somewhere behind her. Now somewhere she had stopped being able to see clearly, and the thing she had no safe name for, somewhere ahead of her, and the distance between the two. Shrinking in ways she had not planned for, and could not stop, and was no longer entirely certain she wanted to. She walked back to the kitchen. She had a dinner to make. The dinner changed everything and nothing at the same time. That was the strange part. Clara had expected she didn't know what she had expected. Something marked. Something that announced itself as a turning point, the way turning points announced themselves in stories. But dinner at Callahan's main table on a Tuesday evening in February turned out to be simply dinner. Emma sat across from Clara and talked about the geometric properties of lattice pie crust, with the focused intensity she brought to all subjects she had recently mastered. Callahan sat at the head of the table and listened and asked questions and refilled Clara's water glass once without making anything of it. The food was the food Clara had made, which meant it was good, and they ate it, and the fire burned in the hearth, and the evening moved at the pace of an ordinary evening. And yet, Clara drove back to her quarters that night, knowing that something had shifted in the room's geometry. Not dramatically, not in any way she could point to and name. But the way a room shifts when furniture is moved, everything technically in the same building, the same walls, the same light, and yet the proportions of the space entirely altered. She was no longer only the cook at the table. She didn't know what she was instead. She knew that Callahan had watched her explain lattice crust to Emma with an expression she had no safe category for, and that twice during the meal he had said something quiet and direct to her. Not to the room, not to Emma, but to her specifically. And both times the way he said it landed differently than things usually landed the way things land, when the person saying them has already crossed some private threshold and is simply waiting to see if you have too. She lay in her quarters that night and looked at the ceiling and thought, "You have 4 months left on this agreement. After that, you can renegotiate or leave. You have a choice." And she held that thought the way you hold something that you know is true and know is not enough. Because the problem was not whether she had a choice. The problem was what she was choosing toward. The town found out about the dinner inside 48 hours. She didn't know how she would never know how, because small towns operated on an information network that defied conventional understanding of how news traveled. But by Thursday morning, when Reed took the supply wagon to Willow Creek, he came back with 3 pieces of information. The price of flour had gone up 2 cents a pound. One of the Henderson brothers had formally filed his statement with the county land office, and people in Willow Creek were talking about Clara Whitmore eating at Wyatt Callahan's table like she was family. Reed delivered all 3 items with identical neutrality, which was itself a form of communication. "How bad?" Clara asked. "Depends on who you ask," Reed said. Agnes Fowler told Millie Chambers it was about time. Pruitt told the men at the barber shop it was inappropriate and someone ought to say something. He paused. Dutch is of the opinion that Pruitt can keep his opinions to himself. "What does Mr. Callahan know?" "Everything," Reed said simply. "He always does." Clara nodded. She went back to work. She had learned by now that information was just information. It was neither good nor bad until someone acted on it, and the acting was the only part she could influence. She was measuring flour when Callahan came in at mid-morning. He closed the kitchen door behind him, which he didn't usually do. "You've heard," she said. "Yes." And he came to the far end of the work table and stood with his hands flat on the surface and looked at her with the direct, undeflected look that she had come to understand was his version of openness, as open as he got, which was more open than most people recognized because they expected openness to look louder. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is something you think I don't want to hear." Clara set down the flour. "All right." "Are you comfortable here?" he said. "Not the work, not the arrangement. I mean, are you comfortable, in your own skin, in this place?" The question surprised her enough that she took a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. Then, because honesty required the full thing, more than I expected to be, more than I've been in a long time. He nodded. "And the talk in town?" "Doesn't change that," she said. "It might get worse," he said. He stopped. He looked at the table. He was working out something. She could see him working it out the way he worked out all difficult things methodically, without rushing, making sure of the ground before he put weight on it. If things between us were to change, the talk would get worse before it got better. Possibly considerably worse. I want you to understand that before I say anything else." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him. "Wyatt," she said. His name. Just his name. The first time she had used it to his face, and the effect of it was immediate. Something in his expression shifted, came closer to the surface. "That is not a reason," she said, "for either of us to do anything differently. People talked when I was only the cook. People will talk regardless of what I am. That's not a factor I can manage, and I stopped trying to manage it in October." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid," he said. "I am afraid," she said. "That's different from being ruled by it." Something moved across his face, fast and deep, the way the deepest things always moved across his face like weather at a distance. "I have not," he started. Stopped. Started again. "Since Martha. I have not." He pressed his lips together. "I don't know how to do this without making it a mistake," he said. "I've been thinking about it since December, and I still don't know." "Nobody does," Clara said quietly. "That's not a solvable problem. That's just what it is." He looked at her. "I know what I want," he said, low and very certain. "I have known for a while. What I don't know is whether it's fair to you. Given the situation, given everything you've already endured because of being here." Clara breathed. "Wyatt," she said again. Ask me what you want to ask me." He held her gaze. "Would you let me court you?" he said. "Properly, openly, so the whole county knows what it is and what it isn't." The word court landed in the kitchen like something solid. Clara stood at her work table with flour on her hands and the fire burning behind her and the ranch moving around them on the other side of the walls. And she looked at Wyatt Callahan, who had come to her kitchen in the cold and made coffee at midnight and said her name like it was simply the right word, who had told Victoria Lawson to her face that Clara's conduct was beyond reproach, who had ridden to Millhaven in a single day on a solution she had thought of while reorganizing the root cellar, who had listed his daughter's dignity as a condition of employment on the first night they met. And she thought about the rule she had made in October. And she thought about Dutch saying, "When you don't have to be afraid anymore." And she thought about $4.60, and she thought about her mother's ledger. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Just that, a single exhale, the kind that carries 4 months of held breath in it. "All right," he said. He straightened. He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but had all the same components. "Then I'll start by taking you to church on Sunday." "People will absolutely lose their minds," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "They will." And this time it was a smile brief and genuine, and entirely his own. He walked out. Clara stood at the work table. She pressed her flour-covered hands flat on the surface. She thought, "This is real. This is an actual thing that is happening." Then she thought, "You should probably finish the bread." She finished the bread. Sunday arrived with the particular crispness of a February morning that had decided to be clear and bright and entirely without mercy for anyone hoping weather might provide an excuse to stay home. Clara wore her best dress, which was navy blue wool and well-made cut for a woman with her build by a seamstress in Willow Creek, who had done the work without commentary on the subject of the build. She had worn it twice, once to her father's funeral, once to her mother's, and putting it on this morning felt strange, like borrowing something from grief and using it for something different. Callahan was waiting with the wagon when she came out of her quarters. He was wearing his good coat. He had his hat in his hand rather than on his head, which she was learning was his version of a formal gesture. He looked at her. "You look well," he said. "You're going to cause a spectacle," she said. "Probably," he agreed. He offered his hand for the step up. She took it. His grip was steady and warm, and he held it precisely long enough and released it precisely when she was settled, and neither of them made anything of it, which somehow made it more of something. They rode to town in the early morning cold and talked about the Henderson filing and the probability of rain in March, and whether Emma was ready for fractions, which she had decided she wanted to learn, because she had identified fractions as the next obstacle in doubling pie recipes accurately. Nobody watching them from the road would have seen anything dramatic. Clara felt the whole weight of it anyway. The simple, enormous ordinariness of sitting next to someone in the cold morning and talking about pie fractions and having that be a thing that was allowed. They arrived at First Methodist at 8:55. The effect was immediate. Not theatrical. People didn't gasp or point. It was subtler and more complete than that. A ripple moving outward from the church steps as people registered, the wagon registered, who was in it, registered the particular arrangement of who was sitting next to whom, and began the rapid social computation that small towns ran on. Clara stepped down from the wagon without hesitation. Callahan stepped down beside her. He did not take her arm. He did not make a performance of it. He simply walked beside her through the church doors, and Emma walked on Clara's other side, and the three of them found a pew and sat down, and the congregation of First Methodist Willow Creek rearranged its understanding of the world around that fact. Reverend Pearson delivered his sermon with slightly more than his usual concentration, which Clara attributed to the need to look at something other than the front left pew. Afterward, in the yard, Agnes Fowler came directly to Clara. She looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once with the decisive air of a woman whose assessment had been confirmed. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Fowler," Clara said. Agnes looked at Callahan. "Wyatt." "Agnes," he said. "It's about time," she said, and moved on. Clara glanced at Callahan. "She said that to me in February," Clara said. She says it to everyone, Callahan said. It's her primary mode of encouragement. Millie Chambers appeared effusive and slightly emotional, and clasped both of Clara's hands and said something warm and incoherent that communicated genuine happiness in the way that incoherence sometimes does better than words. And then Mrs. Holt appeared. She materialized at Clara's left elbow with the precision of a woman who had positioned herself carefully. She was 60 thin, with a face that had settled into permanent readiness for disappointment. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I see Willow Creek has something new to talk about." "It often does," Clara said pleasantly. "I wonder," Mrs. Holt said, with the delicate pause of someone about to say something. "They have been composing for weeks. Whether you've considered what message this sends to the community, given your circumstances." Her eyes moved briefly, deliberately over Clara's figure. Clara felt the familiar cold weight of it, the way that look moved the particular inventory it was conducting. She breathed. She had been breathed on by that look for 25 years. She looked at Mrs. Holt directly, and she said calmly and without heat, "The message it sends, Mrs. Holt, is that a woman who works hard and conducts herself honestly can be respected and valued regardless of what she looks like or where she came from. I think that's a fine message for a community to have." Mrs. Holt's mouth tightened. "I've seen women like you before," she said lower. "And I've met women like you," Clara said equally low. "You've never made me smaller. You've made me clearer about what I won't accept. I'm grateful for that, actually." She turned away. She was shaking slightly. She pressed her hand against her side and made it stop. Callahan was 3 feet away. He had heard it, she could tell by the particular quality of his stillness, the way he had angled himself to be close without intervening, which was exactly right, which was the most precise reading of the situation possible. He said nothing about it until they were back in the wagon heading home. Then he said, "You were extraordinary just now." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what made it extraordinary." She looked at him. I was watching the road. His profile against the winter sky was the profile of a man who had just watched something he had suspected be confirmed, and who was content with what he'd confirmed. "She's been saying things like that my whole life," Clara said quietly. "Not her specifically, but women like her, men like her, people who look at me and do a calculation in the first 2 seconds and hand me the result like it's the truth. And it used to work," she said. "It doesn't anymore." She paused. "I don't entirely know why." Callahan was quiet for a moment. "I think you do," he said. She thought about it. "Because I stopped being the only one who knew the calculation was wrong," she said finally. He nodded. "That's what other people are for," he said. "Not to make you feel better, to confirm what you already know is true." Emma, sitting between them, had been listening with the focused attention she gave all conversations that she calculated to be important. She looked at Clara. "I think Mrs. Holt is very unhappy," Emma said. "Papa says people who try to make others feel small are usually very small themselves." "Your father is right about that," Clara said. Emma considered this. "I think," she said carefully, "that she's going to keep being mean. Some people don't stop." "Some don't," Clara agreed. "So what do you do?" Clara thought about it. "You stop giving them the power to set the terms," she said. "You decide what the truth is about yourself, about your worth, and you hold on to that, and you let the other thing run off like water." Emma was quiet for a moment. She looked at Clara. "You're very good at that," she said. "I'm getting better at it," Clara said honestly. Emma nodded, apparently satisfied. She leaned slightly against Clara's side. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. Just leaned. The way you lean against something when you've decided it's solid enough to hold you. Clara did not move. The wagon rolled toward the ranch. The second twist came from a direction none of them had anticipated, and it came in the shape of Dr. Harlan Webb, the county physician who arrived at Callahan Ranch on a Tuesday in the last week of February and asked to speak with Clara alone. She had been delivering meals to Dutch, whose shoulder had regressed after he pushed it too early, And she came in from the bunkhouse to find Reed standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression of such precise maintained neutrality that she knew immediately something had gone wrong somewhere. Dr. Webb was 62, a quiet man with careful hands and the bedside manner of someone who had delivered bad news often enough to have refined the process into something that was neither brutal nor dishonest. He sat down at the work table. He told her about the examination he had conducted the week before, when Callahan had ridden in requesting a full health assessment. Not for himself, he'd said, but he'd wanted it known whether Clara might benefit from one, and he'd asked Webb to stop by when he could. "That's not what I need to talk to you about," Webb said. Clara sat down. Webb folded his hands. "I understand," he said carefully, "that you've been under considerable stress since the autumn. The loss of your mother, the financial situation, the new position." He paused. "I'm not here with bad news about your health. I want to be clear about that first." "But," Clara said, "but I spoke to Elias Whitmore's doctor in the county seat last week on a separate matter, and your father's name came up in the context of some records that—" Webb stopped, restarted. "Miss Whitmore was your father ever told he had a secondary heir?" The kitchen went very still. Clara looked at Webb. "I beg your pardon," she said. Webb unfolded his hands. He placed a document on the table between them. "Your father had a brother," he said. "You know this, your cousin Robert is his son. What you may not know is that your father also had a prior arrangement before he married your mother with a woman in the county seat that produced a child. A daughter. That daughter died in infancy." Webb paused. "But the arrangement itself involved a transfer of property, a small parcel on the eastern edge of the county that was recorded under your father's name as a trust held for this child, and because the child died without the trust being formally dissolved. That property reverted to my father's estate," Clara said. "Yes," Webb said. "Which means it should have been included in the estate liquidation," Clara said. "Yes," Webb said. "Which means the bank's assessment of the remaining debt is wrong," Clara said. "The parcel covers it." "Covers it and leaves a surplus," Webb said. "Small, but real." Clara sat very still. She thought about Pruitt in his office in October with his ledger and his certainty and his advice that she ought to be thinking about finding a husband. She thought about sitting in this kitchen the morning after she arrived doing the arithmetic of her situation, with the particular flat acceptance of a woman who had taken stock and found the stock was not good. She thought about $4.60. She looked at the document on the table. "Does Pruitt know?" she said. "No," Webb said. "I came to you first." Clara breathed. "Who else knows about this parcel?" "Your father's doctor who brought it to my attention because he felt it was owed to you," Webb said. "And now you and me." The silence lasted a long time. What this meant, what it actually meant, was that Clara Whitmore was not destitute. She had not been destitute since October. The $4.60, the desperate wagon ride east, the position taken because there was no other position. All of it had been real. She had not known, but underneath all of it, there had been a small piece of eastern land standing in her father's estate, waiting to be found. She was not someone who had nothing. She never had been. She just hadn't known. "What do I need to do?" she said. Webb walked her through it. It would require filing a formal challenge to the estate assessment, a correction to the record. It would require almost certainly a direct confrontation with Pruitt, who had either missed this deliberately or carelessly, and either possibility was damning. "How long?" she said. 2 weeks if the county office processes quickly," Webb said. She nodded. She thanked him. She walked him to the door, and then she stood in the kitchen alone and thought about what this changed. Not the ranch, not Callahan, not Emma, not the kitchen organized by smell or the bread schedule or the thing she had no safe name for that had been growing in her chest since sometime in November and had been unnamed but real since December and had been given its first shape in words last Tuesday in a February churchyard. None of that changed. But this changed who she was when she stood in the middle of all of it. She was not someone who had come to Callahan Ranch with nothing. She was someone who had come with everything she needed and hadn't known it yet. That was a different story, and she was the one who got to tell it. She told Callahan that evening. She told him all of it, the property, the trust, the filing, the surplus Pruitt's failure, either deliberate or negligent. She told him plainly and completely because he had asked her once to be honest with him, and she had found since then that honesty with him was the easiest thing she did. Easier than the bread, easier than the pie crust, easier than almost anything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You could leave," he said. Not accusatory, just acknowledging the mathematics. "Yes," she said. "With the parcel as foundation, you could establish yourself independently," he said. "In town or elsewhere. You wouldn't need—" "Wyatt," she said. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "I know what I could do," she said. "I'm telling you what I know. Not asking your permission for anything. Not making an announcement about anything." She paused. "But I wanted you to know. Because you've earned knowing the truth of my situation." He looked at her. "Why?" he said. "Because when you asked to court me," she said carefully, I thought I was someone with very few options, and now I know I'm someone with more. And I want you to know that too. I don't want there to be any confusion about why I'm here." He was very still. "And why are you here?" he said. She held his gaze. "Because I want to be," she said. "Not because I need to be. Not because I have nowhere else to go. Because I want to be here in this kitchen at this table with Emma and with you. That's why." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories. Just opened. The way something opens when the last thing holding it shut finally lets go. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers on the kitchen table, warm and certain, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been afraid," he said, "every day since November, that what I was feeling was that I was taking advantage of a situation. That you were here because you needed to be, and I was reading something into it that wasn't there." He paused. "I am a man who does not move on things he's not certain of, and I have not been certain. Until now." Clara turned her hand over under his. She let her fingers close around his. He looked down at their joined hands on the kitchen table. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't." He stopped, looked up. "I haven't felt this," stopped again. "I know," she said again more softly. He looked at her. The last of whatever had been held back moved entirely off his face, and what was left was simply him, direct and certain, and a little undone, which was the most human she had ever seen him, which was somehow exactly right. "I love you," he said. Flat, clear. The way he said everything true, without decoration, without softening, just the thing itself. The kitchen was warm. The fire burned. Clara Whitmore sat at the work table of Callahan Ranch with her hand in Wyatt. Callahan's hand, and felt something she had stopped believing in the specific way you stop believing in things that have been denied long enough that you mistake the absence for impossibility. She felt it anyway. "I love you too," she said. He closed his eyes briefly. 1 second, opened them. "The whole county's going to have a great deal to say about this," he said. "They were going to anyway," she said. Something pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Reckon you're right," he said. "I generally am," she said. He laughed. Just briefly, just once. But it was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had not laughed like that in a very long time, and found it surprised him. Clara looked at him and thought, there he is. Not the cold rancher. Not the controlled employer. Not the man who built walls. Just him right there laughing in the kitchen. She thought about Emma saying Papa smiles now sometimes. She thought about Dutch saying an old man's privilege. She thought about Agnes Fowler saying it's about time in the churchyard. She thought about October and a banker's desk and $4.60. She thought about the distance between that morning and this evening, and how the distance was measured not in miles or months, but in accumulated small moments of being seen. Really seen correctly. Seen until the accumulated weight of it was enough to shift something that had been stuck for a very long time. She had not come to Callahan Ranch to find this. She had come to survive. She had done both. 3 days after that evening in the kitchen, Victoria Lawson made her final move. Clara had been expecting it in the way you expect weather that's been threatening, not certain of the shape, certain of the arrival. What she hadn't expected was the form it took. Victoria went to Gerald Lawson's banker in the county seat and had a formal document drawn up withdrawing the Lawson Holdings water agreement from any renewal consideration, citing a breach of community standards by Callahan Ranch, and had that document sent to 3 parties: the county land office, Reverend Pearson at First Methodist, and Wyatt Callahan's primary cattle buyer in Abilene. The document implied that Wyatt Callahan's household had become a matter of moral concern in the county and suggested that business partners with reputational sensitivities might wish to revisit their arrangements accordingly. Callahan received his copy on a Friday morning. He brought it to the kitchen. He set it on the table. He sat down. He looked at Clara. "She wants to make its a choice," he said. "The water, the buyers, the reputation, she's assembled everything she has, and she's putting it on one side of the scale. Against me," Clara said. "Against us," he said. He looked at the document. Clara looked at him. "What do you want to do?" she said. He looked up. "I want to know what you want to do," he said. "This is your life she's making a calculation on. Your name, not only mine." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about everything Victoria Lawson had done since October. The letters, the implications, the church women, the banker, her father's leverage, the Abilene buyers. She thought about the architecture of it, how it was built, what it was built to accomplish, what it assumed about Clara's position and Clara's fragility and the limits of what Clara would endure. It assumed she realized that Clara would break before Wyatt would. That had always been the calculation. That a woman in Clara's position, large, plain-dressed, recently arrived, recently bereaved, financially uncertain. No family name to call on, would eventually find the cost too high. Would take the exit that was always being quietly offered. Would choose preservation over exposure. Victoria had never in 4 months of sustained effort considered the possibility that Clara Whitmore might look at everything on the scale and not flinch. Clara picked up the document. She read it fully. She set it down. She looked at Wyatt Callahan. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her. "The buyers," he said, "will either be loyal to the product or they won't," she said. "And if they're loyal to gossip over quality cattle, they're not buyers you want long-term anyway." "The water arrangement is a problem you'll solve," she said. "You solved the Henderson problem. You rode to Millhaven in a day. This is the same category of problem." I was watching her with that look, the deep one. "And your name," he said quietly. "She's implying things in that document that will follow you, even when it's resolved, even after." Clara looked at him steadily. "Wyatt," she said. "My name has been in people's mouths since the week I arrived. I've been managing that arithmetic for 4 months. She paused. "The question is not whether she can damage my reputation. She can somewhat for a time. The question is whether that's a reason for either of us to do anything differently." She held his gaze. "Is it a reason for you?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "Immediate. Flat." "Then it's not a reason for me either," she said. The document lay between them on the table. He reached across and picked it up. He folded it once. He stood. "I'm going to make 2 visits this afternoon," he said. "Pruitt first about the estate misfiling, then Gerald Lawson." His voice was entirely level. "I intend to make clear to Gerald that his daughter has been engaged in a sustained campaign against a member of my household, that the county land office has documentation of the Henderson sale circumstances, and that I am prepared to be considerably less quiet about my knowledge of those circumstances if the pressure on this ranch doesn't end." Clara looked at him. "That's a significant threat," she said. "It's a significant situation," he said. "He won't like it." "No," Callahan said. "He won't." He looked at her directly. "But he'll respect it. Men like Gerald Lawson only respond to force. I've been too polite for 4 months." His jaw set. "I'm done being polite." Something in Clara's chest shifted, something that had nothing to do with the Lawson document or the water agreement or the cattle buyers and everything to do with the man standing across the table from her who had just decided fully and finally that he was done allowing other people to set the terms. "All right," she said. "I'll be back by supper," he said. "I'll have it ready," she said. He put on his hat. He looked at her once more, the full, direct, undeflected look. "Clara," he said. "Go," she said. "I'll be here." He walked out. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his boots on the porch, and the sound of the horse in the yard, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch moving around her, and she thought, this is the moment. Not the declaration in the kitchen. Not Sunday at the church. This right now is the actual moment. The moment where everything that was theoretical becomes real. She pressed her hands flat on the work table. She breathed. She was not afraid. She was the opposite of afraid. She was, for the first time in her life, completely and irreversibly certain of exactly where she was supposed to be. She started supper. He came back at 6:45. He walked in and sat down, and she put food in front of him and sat across from him, and Emma came in and sat between them and talked about fractions with fierce enthusiasm. And Callahan answered Emma's questions and ate his supper, and once across the table met Clara's eyes. He nodded once. She understood. It was done. She didn't ask the details that evening. She got them later that Gerald Lawson had listened with the calculated attention of a businessman, weighing exposure, that the Henderson documentation had landed exactly as hard as Callahan had predicted, that by the end of the conversation, the water agreement had been quietly reinstated, and no further documents had been sent to Abilene. Victoria Lawson left Willow Creek 3 weeks later to visit relatives in St. Louis. She did not come back for 7 months. By the time she did, the situation she had been trying to prevent had become the situation she would have to live alongside for the rest of her life. Clara did not celebrate any of it. She simply kept working. She had learned that the best response to being underestimated was not triumph. It was continuation. You kept going. You kept building. You kept proving, not to the people who doubted you, but to yourself again and again, in the small daily work of being the person you had decided to be, that you were exactly who you knew yourself to be. That was the only victory that lasted. She knew that now. She had known it actually since October, on a boardwalk in Willow Creek, with 30 seconds to compose herself before lifting her chin and getting back to work. She had just needed 4 months, and 1 cowboy, and 1 small girl, and a kitchen organized by smell to understand how true it was. March came in like it had somewhere important to be. The cold broke in the second week, not gradually, but all at once, the way things changed on the frontier, without warning, without negotiation. One morning, simply different from the one before. The ranch hands moved differently in the warmer air, quicker and louder, the particular energy of men who had been cooped up by winter and were now released back into the full dimensions of the work they understood. Clara noticed all of it from the kitchen. She had been noticing things from the kitchen for 5 months now, and she had gotten very good at reading the ranch through sound and movement, and the small social signals that passed between men who worked closely together, the way you could tell a good day from a difficult one by the rhythm of boots crossing the yard, the way you could tell morale by whether the hands came to the table talking or silent. March was loud. March was good. She was at the stove on the second Thursday of the month when Emma came in 40 minutes early, which never happened. Emma was constitutionally punctual. She treated 2 o'clock as a fixed law of the universe, not a suggestion. And so when she appeared at 12:20 with her notebook and her flour-dusted apron already tied, and her expression doing the specific work of containing something large, Clara turned from the stove immediately. "What happened?" Clara said. Emma sat down. She put both hands flat on the work table. She looked at Clara with her father's eyes, and the particular intensity of a child who has made a decision and is now executing it. "I need to ask you something," Emma said. "All right," Clara said. "Are you going to stay?" Emma said. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at this child, 8 years old now. Emma's birthday having passed in January with a cake Clara had made, and Callahan had decorated with more earnestness than skill, both of them watching Emma count the candles with the solemnity she brought to important arithmetic. What makes you ask? Clara said. Because, Emma said carefully, you found out about the land. And the land means you don't have to be here. And Papa says people should only be places they choose to be, not places they're stuck. She pressed her lips together. So I need to know if you're choosing. Clara came to the table. She sat down across from Emma fully, the way she gave Emma her full attention, the way she had from the first day, because Emma deserved it. Emma, she said, look at me. Emma looked. I am choosing, Clara said. Every single morning when I get up before 4 o'clock and come to this kitchen. That is a choice. Not obligation. Not desperation. A choice I make because this is where I want to be. Emma's jaw was still set. Why? Because, Clara said, this is the first place I have ever been where people looked at me and saw me. Not what I look like. Not what I don't have. Me. She paused. You were the first one. You and your pie crust geometry, and your refusal to accept vague answers. You saw me before most people did. Something moved across Emma's face. Fast and then gone the way her father's emotions moved deep and swift and carefully managed. Papa loves you, Emma said. Flat, factual, the way she said everything true. I know, Clara said. And you love him. Yes. So you should get married, Emma said. Because that's what people who love each other do when they're going to stay. Clara looked at her. She thought about the particular quality of an 8-year-old's logic, the way it moved in a straight line from premise to conclusion, without getting tangled in the complications that adults spent so much energy managing. Emma had identified the facts, processed them, and reached the obvious conclusion, and was now presenting it to the relevant parties as though the delay was a simple administrative oversight. That, Clara said, is a conversation that involves your father. I know, Emma said. I already had it with him. Clara stared. This morning, Emma said. At breakfast, I told him the same thing I just told you. She looked at her notebook. He turned very red and said it was a private matter, but he didn't say I was wrong. Clara pressed her lips together hard. He didn't say you were wrong, she repeated. No, Emma said. He just said private matter and then left for the barn very fast. She looked up. Papa only leaves rooms fast when he doesn't want to explain something. Emma, Clara said carefully, you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met. Emma considered this with appropriate gravity. I know, she said. Can we make something today? I want to concentrate on something. Absolutely, Clara said. They made bread. Emma kneaded the dough with focused ferocity, and neither of them spoke much, and the kitchen was warm, and outside, the March sun moved across the yard, and somewhere in the barn, Wyatt Callahan was almost certainly thinking about a conversation with his 8-year-old daughter that had moved considerably faster than anything he had planned. He came to the kitchen that evening at 7. Not for coffee, not for ranch business, not for any pretext. He came directly, and he sat down at the table, and he looked at Clara with the expression she had learned meant he had made a decision and was now implementing it. Emma talked to you, he said. She did, Clara said. She talked to me first, he said. At breakfast. She mentioned that. He looked at the table. He looked up. The careful, controlled face had something in it she hadn't seen before, something that was not quite nerves, but in the same county. Something that meant this mattered to him in a way that made the controlled face insufficient. I had a plan, he said. For how I was going to, I had thought about this, how to say it, when. I had a specific plan. And Emma accelerated your timeline, Clara said. Considerably, he said. Clara looked at him. She thought about October. She thought about the wagon ride east and the rule she had made, and the $4.60, and the kitchen that was broken, and the man who had stood in a doorway and listed his daughter's dignity as a condition of employment. She thought about midnight coffee and December snow and the smell of ground spices and a cracked work table fixed in a single day. She thought about the full length of everything that had brought them both to this kitchen, this table, this moment. Wyatt, she said. Clara. He looked at her steadily. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean. You know that. I know that, she said. And I am not a man who moves without being certain. He paused. I am certain. She waited. I want you to be my wife, he said. Direct, clear. The way he said everything that mattered, without softening, without decoration. Just the thing itself laid on the table between them. Not because it would settle the talk or solve a problem or make the situation easier, but because you are the person I want to be in the same room with for the rest of my life. Because this ranch became a home when you came into it. Because my daughter is better, and I am better, and... He stopped. His voice, always controlled, had roughened slightly at the edges. Because I have been alone for a long time, and I did not know how much I had forgotten what it felt like not to be until you. The kitchen was very still. Clara breathed. She thought about all the things she could say, all the careful, measured, honest things that were also true. About how she had made a rule. About how she had arrived with nothing and discovered she had more than she knew. About what it meant that she was choosing this fully and freely from a position of actual choice. She thought about saying all of it. Instead, she said, yes, just that. He closed his eyes. 1 second. He opened them, and she was still there, and he exhaled the way he had exhaled in February when she said she would let him court her. The exhale of a man releasing something he'd been holding for longer than was comfortable. Yes, he said as though confirming it to himself. Yes, she said again. Certain. He reached across the table. He took her hand. He held it the way he had held it in February, warm and steady, and without ceremony, which was the most like him, which was exactly right. From the direction of the main house came a sound that was unmistakably Emma. A very controlled, very deliberate, carefully executed sound of someone who had pressed their ear to a wall and was now making no noise whatsoever. Clara looked at the wall. Callahan looked at the wall. Emma. Callahan said not loudly. A pause. Yes, Papa. Emma's voice from the other side of the wall was a masterpiece of studied innocence. Go to bed, he said. Another pause. Did she say yes? Emma asked. Callahan looked at Clara. Clara pressed her lips together. Yes, Callahan said. She said yes. The sound from the other side of the wall was brief, fierce, and completely unguarded. The pure, uncalculated sound of an 8-year-old who has gotten exactly what she wanted and cannot contain it for one more second, and then footsteps quick and light retreating. Callahan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Callahan. She laughed, fully, completely, without managing it. The laugh of a woman who has forgotten somewhere in the last 5 months that this was something she was allowed to do without apology and has just remembered. He watched her laugh, and something in his face went entirely soft, the last wall entirely down, and he smiled. The real one, the full one. The one Emma had been reporting on since November. It was, Clara thought, the finest thing she had ever seen. They were married in April on a Saturday that had decided to cooperate fully with the occasion by producing the kind of clear, warm morning that felt like a reward for having survived winter. The ceremony was at First Methodist, small. Not because they had been asked to keep it small, but because the people who mattered fit into a small space, Reed and Dutch Cody, and the hands who had drawn straws for who could take a Saturday morning. Agnes Fowler in the front pew, looking like a woman whose opinion had been vindicated and was enjoying the fact. With Christian restraint, Millie Chambers, with a handkerchief she'd brought deliberately, Dr. Webb standing near the back in his good coat. Emma stood beside Clara. She had been the one to find the ribbon for Clara's hair, presenting it at breakfast with the grave ceremony of a child performing an official function. Dark blue to match the navy dress, the good one, the one that had been to 2 funerals and was now being borrowed for something entirely different. Clara had worn it. Reverend Pearson was brief and precise in the way of a man who had understood approximately 3 minutes into the process of knowing Clara Whitmore that brevity was more her register than flourish. When he asked Wyatt Callahan whether he took this woman, Callahan looked at Clara and said, I do, in the same voice he used for everything true, flat and certain, and without a single extra word. When he asked Clara whether she took this man, she looked at him, at the man who had come to her kitchen at midnight, who had ridden to Millhaven in a day, who had stood in a churchyard beside her and let Mrs. Holt run off her like water, who had made coffee at a cold hearth without asking. And she said, "I do," in a voice that was quiet and clear, and carried to every corner of the room. Agnes Fowler said something very quiet to the woman beside her. The woman beside her nodded. Millie Chambers used the handkerchief. Dutch, who had not been known to display emotion at any point in 11 years, looked at a fixed point above the altar with the focused attention of a man managing something. Emma, standing beside Clara, took Clara's hand. At the moment, Reverend Pearson concluded the ceremony and held it and did not let go. Clara held on in return. The twist that came after the wedding was the kind nobody warned you about. Not a crisis, not a confrontation, not a letter or a threat or a calculation designed to diminish her. It was quieter than all of those, and in some ways more demanding. It was the discovery that being chosen openly and completely, and before witnesses, did not automatically dissolve the habits of a woman who had spent 25 years being assessed and found wanting. It happened in small moments. The first time she was introduced as Mrs. Callahan at the general store and felt the instinctive brace, the tightening against anticipated dismissal, only to find that it didn't come. The first time she sat at Callahan's table, not as the cook who had been invited, but as the woman who lived there, and had to sit with the strangeness of that. The first time someone in town treated her not as the woman who had come from nowhere with uncertain intentions, but simply as Wyatt Callahan's wife, with the particular county-level respect that attached to that fact, and she had to decide what to do with a respect that had arrived via a name rather than earned. She talked to Dutch about it one afternoon in April, when he stopped by the kitchen in his customary way, and she was less careful than usual about what she said. "It feels borrowed," she said. "The respect, like it belongs to the name and I'm just adjacent to it." Dutch looked at her with 11 years of observation behind his eyes. "Let me tell you something," he said. "Every man on this ranch had respect for you 4 months before you had the name. You want to know when it started? First morning. 5:30. Those biscuits." He put down his cup. "The name didn't create the respect. The respect was already there. The name just made the rest of the county catch up to what we already knew." Clara looked at him. "That's," she started. "True," he said. "That's what it is." She sat with that for a while. She sat with it long enough that it stopped feeling borrowed. It took about 3 weeks, which was, she thought, considerably faster than the 25 years she had spent learning to distrust it. The conversation with Emma happened in May, on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock, which was still their time. It had not changed with the wedding, and neither of them had suggested it should, because some things were correct and didn't need adjusting. They were making pastry, a more complicated variant than the one they had attempted in February, and Emma was concentrating with the focused intensity she brought to all technical challenges, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of butter, and the ranch outside was loud with spring work, and Clara was watching Emma's hands and thinking about nothing in particular when Emma said, without looking up from the dough, "Do you regret coming here?" Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "Not any of it," Emma pressed. "The letters, Mrs. Holt, Mr. Pruitt, Robert." "No," Clara said. "Because all of it was part of how I got here. You can't remove the difficult parts and keep the good ones. They come together." Emma processed this, still working the dough. "I was afraid you'd leave," Emma said. "In December, after the letter from Mrs. Lawson. I was afraid you'd decide it was too hard." "I know," Clara said. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want you to stay because of me," Emma said. "I wanted you to stay because you wanted to." Clara looked at this child, this extraordinary, careful, precise child, who had understood at 7 years old the difference between charity and choice, between staying out of obligation and staying out of desire, and who had said nothing and managed her own fear alone because she didn't want to be the reason someone made a decision they didn't fully mean. "Emma," she said. Emma looked up. "I stayed because I wanted to," Clara said. "You were part of why I wanted to. But you were never the obligation. You were the joy." Emma looked at her for a long moment. Her chin went up slightly the way it did when she was holding something in. "Okay," she said in the voice that meant considerably more than okay. Okay, Clara said. They went back to the pastry. After a while, Emma said, "It came out better than February." "You've been practicing the geometry," Clara said. "I have," Emma said with satisfaction. They put it in the oven and waited, and the kitchen was warm and outside the ranch moved through its spring business, and inside two people sat at a work table and were entirely at ease with each other, which was its own form of extraordinary, even if nobody was measuring it. It was August when Pruitt came to the ranch. Not sent for, he came of his own initiative in the particular way of men who have done something they can no longer avoid accounting for, and have decided that arriving first and appearing cooperative is marginally better than waiting to be summoned. Clara was in the kitchen. She heard him in the yard. She heard Reed go to find Callahan. She kept working. 20 minutes later, Callahan came to the kitchen doorway. "Pruitt is here," he said. "I know," she said. "He wants to speak to you," he said. "He doesn't have to. I can send him away." She looked at Callahan steadily. "No," she said. "Let him in." Callahan looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Pruitt came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which was itself a statement. The banker who had sat behind his oak desk and told her she ought to be thinking about finding a husband was now standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, like a man who understood finally the direction the power had moved. He was older than she remembered, or she was seeing him differently. Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. He looked around the kitchen. He looked at her. He cleared his throat. "The estate misfiling," he said. "I want you to know, I want to tell you directly, that the omission of the Whitmore parcel from the estate assessment was not deliberate." Clara looked at him. "It was negligent," he said. The word cost him something. She could see it cost him. "I should have found it. It was my responsibility to find it, and I didn't, and you paid the consequence of that. The debt you believed you owed the decisions you made on the basis of that belief." He stopped. "I owe you an apology." The kitchen was quiet. Clara looked at Gerald Pruitt, at the man who had not looked up from his ledger, who had said a woman in your position ought to be thinking about finding a husband, who had forwarded her information to Robert without authorization, who had been in October the final door closing on a life she had known. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about the 25 years of being assessed, and the $4.60, and the boardwalk, and the 30 seconds, and the lifted chin. She thought about the kitchen, and Emma and Callahan saying, "I love you" in the flat, certain voice he used for true things. She thought about what it cost to carry resentment forward versus what it cost to set it down. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it directly." Pruitt blinked. He had expected more. She could see he had expected more, had braced for it, had prepared a secondary position. "That's all," he said. "That's all," she said. "You were negligent. You've acknowledged it. The estate has been corrected. We're moving forward." She paused. "Unless there's something else." He looked at her for a moment, the rapid recalculation, the revised assessment. "No," he said. "No, I don't suppose there is." He left. Callahan, who had been standing in the doorway the entire time, came in when Pruitt's buggy left the yard. "You didn't say half of what you could have said," he said. "I know," she said. "Why not?" She thought about it. "Because I don't need to," she said. "I needed to in October. I needed him to understand what he'd done, and I needed it to count for something. But it already counted. It counted the day I walked out of his office and got on a wagon and came here." She looked at Callahan. "Everything that happened because of his negligence is now part of how I got to this kitchen. I'm not grateful for the negligence, but I'm not going to spend any more of my life inside it either." Callahan looked at her. "You're the most complete person I've ever known," he said. She looked at him. "You've been spending too much time with me," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "I intend to keep doing it." She turned back to the stove. She was smiling. The last Sunday of September, Agnes Fowler came to the ranch for dinner, not a formal occasion. She arrived mid-afternoon with a jar of preserves and the air of a woman exercising a privilege she had decided she had earned, and Clara set an extra plate without being asked, and they sat at the main table, all four of them, and ate and talked. And Emma explained to Agnes the principles of lattice crust geometry with such thorough precision that Agnes declared she was going to implement it immediately and had wasted 30 years doing it incorrectly. After dinner, Agnes sat with Clara on the porch while Callahan and Emma did something involving a fence post in the east yard that Emma had apparently identified as geometrically compromised. Agnes watched them. "You know," she said, "I came to your kitchen in February to tell you to leave." "I know," Clara said. "I was wrong," Agnes said, simply, directly. The way Clara had learned to appreciate no excess, no decoration. "You changed your mind inside 20 minutes, Clara said. "That's fast for a woman who's been right about everything for 40 years. Agnes looked at her sideways. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, something that was in the same neighborhood as a smile, if not quite. "You're very direct," Agnes said. "I learned it from the people around me," Clara said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. "You're good for him," she said, looking out at the yard where Callahan was crouched beside the fence post while Emma lectured him about angles. "And for her. But also, and I want you to hear this place is good for you. You're not just what you've given here. You're what you've become here. Those are different things." Clara looked at the yard. She looked at her husband crouched in the dirt, listening to his daughter explain fence post geometry with the absolute focused attention of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. She looked at Emma standing over him with her notebook and her pencil fierce and precise and entirely certain of her own authority on the subject. She thought about October. She thought about the rule. She thought about how you could make a rule that saved your life and still discover that the life the rule saved was larger than the rule had imagined. She thought about what Dutch had said when you don't have to be afraid anymore. She was not afraid. She was in the clear. September afternoon in the 4th year of the decade, and the first year of a life she had not planned for, and could not have invented, and would not trade for any other arrangement the world had to offer. She was not afraid. She was home. She had been home, she realized, for some time. She just hadn't known it until she understood that home was not a place you found. It was a place you built with your hands, and your honesty, and your refusal to become less than yourself. One cracked work table, and one fixed window, and one real conversation at a time. Years later, when Emma was 17, and had developed opinions about everything, and expressed them with the particular confident precision of her father, and the warm directness of her mother. She asked Clara on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock in the same kitchen, where they had always talked, whether she had ever regretted the rule she made on the wagon ride east. Clara considered the question. "No," she said. "The rule got me here." Emma looked at her steadily. "But you broke it." "I didn't break it," Clara said. "I outgrew it. There's a difference." She looked at her daughter entirely in every way that mattered. "The rule said I wouldn't marry anyone just because the world told me I had no other choice. And I didn't. I married your father because I chose him. Because he chose me. Because we both knew what we were choosing and chose it anyway." Emma thought about this for a long moment. "That's a good distinction," she said. "It's an important one," Clara said. Emma nodded, satisfied. She turned back to the dough she was working. She was teaching herself bread. Now the advanced techniques, the ones that required patience and time, and the willingness to start over if the first attempt wasn't right. She had her mother's hands for it. She had her father's stubbornness. She would be fine. Clara Whitmore Callahan stood in the kitchen she had fixed in October and organized by smell and made her own and raised a child in and loved a man in, and she looked at her daughter's bent head and her capable hands and the warm certainty of a life fully, deliberately, uncompromisingly chosen, and she understood finally completely, with the settled clarity of a woman who had arrived somewhere real, that the road she had feared most on a cold October morning had been all along the road that led her exactly here, not because she had no other choice, because she had every choice, and she had chosen this. That was the only story that had ever mattered, and it was entirely, irrevocably, gloriously hers.